Richard McAnulty and his wife of 30 years, Diane, live on the outskirts of Indiana, Pennsylvania.
It's a college town. Everybody knows everybody, and it's a nice place to live.
And in their quaint small town, everyone knows 47-year-old Richard.
Richard McAnulty was a very strong-willed person. He was very outspoken. It was his way or the highway.
He was kind of loud, like you knew he was in the room.
Richard's brash persona stands in stark contrast to Diane's.
Diane is a very pleasant-looking woman.
She was more shy, demure, and nurturing.
She pretty much went to work and took care of the house.
After 3 decades of marriage, the spark between them is long gone.
Richard and Diane had separate bedrooms. They didn't sleep together. They were living together, but not sleeping together. It was like they were both in the same house, but not really close.
Most people's lives have been married that long. The initial love and excitement is going to wear off after some time.
I think that for the large part, it was a marriage of convenience.
After losing his position as a building inspector, Richard now spends part of every day looking for work.
He had lost his job, so that was one thing that he was not in control of anymore. For anybody, that's a hard thing to deal with.
What do you got going on today?
I don't know. I think I'm just gonna do some things around the house. You know.
Very good. You gonna get to that gardening or what?
Hopefully. That's the plan.
So Richard takes out his frustrations on his long-suffering wife.
Diane let him be the boss. I believe that they matched that way. I think that's why they've got along.
Hi,
See you later.
All right.
To escape his work worries and the boredom of his home life, Richard regularly heads to the town's social club for a few drinks.
Most of those clubs are basically where the local people get together in the evenings and socialize. It's more geared for families and middle-aged people. They're very simple, shot in a beer type bar.
He almost never brings his wife with him, insisting Diane stay at home alone.
He wanted to limit Diane's world, which is if Diane go to work, Diane come home and take care of the house so he could go out and do whatever he wanted to do.
He saw Diane as his property and as basically his servant, somebody that he should be able to control. She shouldn't be able to make any decisions or life changes without his blessing.
Come on, blow on that. Blow on that right there. Blow on it. Blow on it. Come on.
At the club,
Good.
Richard is confident and outgoing. Very different from the gloomy, short-tempered husband he is at home.
He was kind of loud.
$15. $15. Now you get that beer.
And he had his friends there that usually were around him.
He was not meek and mild. He was not a wallflower. You knew that he was there.
All right.
Eventually, his brash swagger attracts the attention of one of the club's regulars, a sexy older woman named Doris.
Doris is what I would call a pistol, a piece of work, a lot of fun to be around.
Doris is a firecracker.
How much longer, exactly, were you going to pretend not to notice me?
Obviously, I must not have seen you.
And without a second thought for Diane, Richard flirts with a beautiful seductress.
I think Richard was attracted to Doris because she was completely opposite of Diane.
Doris is a very outgoing person, and Diane isn't. If she would be in a club, you would definitely notice her.
She was somebody that was impulsive and kind of did what she wanted to do. And being with somebody who's exciting is very exciting.
Seeing Doris gives Richard an even more compelling reason to visit the club. and he makes a regular habit of it.
Like everybody knows each other, no small community, so everybody knew him and everybody knew Doris, and they would see them together.
But Richard doesn't care who sees them. In fact, one night, in a cruel twist, he even invites his wife, Diane, to leave their home and join them.
Richard and Doris would be sitting in the club, and Richard and Diane would speak to each other on their cell phones, and he'd say, "I'm down at the club. Why don't you come on down as well?" And that Diane would eventually show up at the club.
Hi. I'm Diane. Doris, nice to meet you.
Diane, you are adorable.
Thank you.
Richard probably felt really good about himself that he could have these two women wanting him. He was able to get away with it and have these two women in the same room interacting. In some ways, that made him king of his own fiefdom.
Doris is warm and friendly to Diane, and no one questions her intentions, especially not Richard's unsuspecting wife.
You'd go out to the clubs and all three of them would be there. He would get really inebriated. She would tell Diana, "I'll take care of him. You can go home and I'll bring him home and everything." She trusted Doris that Doris would bring Rich home okay.
Okay.
All right, don't worry, I'll see you in a little while.
Okay, bye.
I think Richard is the type of guy who doesn't really respect women, but objectifies them. So he uses them as a tool to build his ego up.
It's all still part of Richard's power game, and it's one Diane can never win. With his wife confined to the house by his orders, Richard is free to pursue his friendship with Doris, and it isn't long before it evolves into something much more intimate.
I'm following you.
All right.
At some point, Richard and Doris became involved with a sexual relationship.
What prompts certain people to have an affair is they want to feel alive again. And it sounds like in this case, Richard wanted a mirror image of himself. He liked himself and he wanted somebody who was like him.
Doris is confident and assertive, the complete opposite of the way Diane behaves around him.
Doris would tell Richard what to do. She would more or less control Richard rather than Richard controlling her, because Richard was younger than her.
Doris was exciting. She was somebody that did what she wanted to do. And when you're having an affair, you want to be with somebody where you can be spontaneous with, and somebody you can have this amazing sexual desire towards.
And Doris is getting something out of it, too.
It kind of excited her that she was with a younger man.
Doris said that they would come home to her house and have sex, and she made a joke, "It's nice I bring a younger guy home and we have sex, and then I just kick him out."
Time to go.
She was not a person that would be dominated or would be controlled.
For months, Richard sees Doris whenever he wants, while continuing to keep his wife, Diane, under lock and key.
Diane was left home alone by herself, and after a period of time that she would become lonely.
Richard has no idea that his controlling ways are slowly eating away at his wife's confidence.
Diane was a very lonely, withdrawn, sad woman.
If Diane suspects her husband is cheating, she never forces the issue with him. But her desperate need for contact is about to push her into a new and dark obsession. In early 2009, she takes a radical step to find some small happiness for herself.
She discovered that she could seek out other relationships on the internet.
Diane was definitely searching for companionship, friendship, someone that she could confide in, someone that would be her safe place.
And one day, Diane encounters a new face in one of the chat rooms. A 37-year-old man who just happens to live nearby. His name is Harry Mears.
Harry Mears stayed at home a lot by himself. I don't think he had a lot of outside contact with anybody.
Harry Mears was a former high school college athlete. He was well over 6 foot tall, pretty sturdily built guy. I think Harry and Diane were both looking for companionship and affection.
But Harry is hoping to find more than just a sympathetic ear. Before long, he sends Diane an email with a suggestion. It will transform their online friendship into something much more taboo.
The messages that Harry had sent were sexually oriented.
They seem to develop a fantasy relative to a master-slave relationship. Harry being the master and Diane being the slave.
Slave master or sadomasochistic kind of relationship is where one person dominates. There is one person that's in control and one person who basically has to tolerate whatever it is that the person in control dishes out.
It's an extreme move. Harry has never met Diane, and his provocative suggestion could easily frighten her off. But after years of being bullied by her husband, Diane is used to being submissive. What's new is turning it into a sexual game. And instead of putting her off, the idea turns her on. She shoots back an encouraging reply. It's the beginning of a scorching online connection that will sweep the lonely housewife into a dark and thrilling new world. It's 2009 in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Diane McAnulty has just agreed to embark on a kinky online affair with a man named Harry.
Slave master or sadomasochistic kind of relationship is where there is one person that's in control and one person who is the submissive.
She's looking to escape a marriage where she's either put down or ignored. But she has no idea just how severe the consequences will be for her new, twisted relationship. Once Diane lets Harry know she's game to be his virtual sex slave, he is quick to let her know what he expects.
He wrote instructions on how he wanted her to behave, what role he wanted her to play.
There was a lot of situations where one person would be demeaned and ordered to do certain things that the average person would not be involved in.
Over the next few weeks, Diane and Harry exchange a flurry of emails. With each message, Harry becomes more dominating. And as he issues commands telling Diane what to do, the beleaguered housewife gets a new sexual thrill in being bossed around.
Richard and Harry were both controlling. The way that they controlled their world looked very different. Diane's drawn to somebody who can set limits with her, and she liked the idea of knowing somebody else was in the driver's seat. So Diane chose the role of being the submissive, both in her real life and in her fantasy life. This was a role that felt very much a part of who she was as a person, and she liked it. It wasn't negative to her. It was sexy, it was appealing, it was attractive.
As weeks become months, the master-slave sex talk between Diane and Harry only grows more intense. If Richard discovered what his wife was up to, his anger would be explosive. But luckily for Diane, he's too busy with Doris to notice.
From Richard's standpoint, he has the girlfriend that he can go out and he gets along with, that he has fun with.
Diane really believed that he would never find out because he didn't care.
By the middle of 2009, Diane is emailing back and forth with Harry at every opportunity. Now that her sex master is confident she's willing to play ball, he starts pushing to see just how far she's prepared to go.
Harry and Diane would share different scenarios with each other. For instance, Diane would be on the street and her car would not start.
Pretend your car has broken down. The hood of your vehicle should be up.
Harry would come along and take charge of the situation.
The messages all were instructions from him to her, directing her what to do. They're very graphic. Described activities, props that would be used. He described how he wanted her to behave.
Get on your knees.
He described the things that he wanted her to say in response to him as they went on with their affair.
I want you softly chanting, "I am here for your pleasure, Master Harry."
You know, I think people like to assume they know what somebody's sexual appetite or preference is just by looking at them. But that's not necessarily the case. You could have somebody who's very shy, like Diane, really be very wild and even kinky in her sexual life.
And Diane loves every raunchy second of it.
One of the reasons why people seek out fantasy lives is because real life is so difficult. Fantasy is a way to escape that. It's very often hard to just stop there. There's a desire to test drive it out in real life.
With a pent-up sexual tension between them becoming too much to bear, Diane and Harry take a fateful step. And since they live close to one another, they arrange a face-to-face meeting.
At some point in time, they agree to meet in person and start a sexual relationship.
One day, Diane sneaks out and heads to the home of the man who calls himself her master. Diane and Harry have talked about all the sexually explicit things they want to do to one another. And now, for the first time, they make those fantasies a reality.
I think everybody is looking for the perfect relationship. That's probably what prompted Diane and Harry to take it to the next level. It felt so perfect in this fantasy chat room virtual reality. How could they not give themselves the opportunity to experience this perfection in person?
They had a romantic relationship. They had a sexual relationship.
This taboo affair provides Diane with a desperately needed break from her isolated existence with Richard.
I think the fact that as long as Diane had somebody that was attentive to her and that wanted her to be there, if it was a different type of affection or if it led into a different area, Diane was looking for whatever type of affection she could get.
For Diane and Harry, being physically together is like a powerful drug, fueling a raging addiction for each other. After having sex, the new lovers can't wait to get back in front of their computer screens so they can take their provocative dialogue to even more salacious levels.
It wasn't just, I really had a good time last night. It was, descriptive about what they were doing.
Up until now, Diane has been at pains to keep her secret life with Harry under wraps. But one day in 2009, Richard is at home working on the computer. With no job to keep him busy and plenty of time on his hands, he starts to dig around.
Richard would go into the family computer and check up on Diane.
Somehow Richard learned to access Diane's email account.
But it's not just out of curiosity.
Is he looking for guilt displacement because he's having his own little affair with Doris? And he's looking to get something on Diane?
Richard is totally unprepared to learn what his meek, submissive wife has been doing in her spare time.
Richard discovered the emails between Harry and Diane and the explicit nature of these emails.
Laid out for Richard in black and white is every sordid detail of his wife's tawdry affair. It's a dark side to Diane that he never knew existed. It's about to destroy all their lives. After 30 years of marriage, Richard McAnulty is having an affair with an attractive older woman named Doris. He thinks his downtrodden wife, Diane, is sitting at home waiting for him.
Richard was a controlling person. He wanted to know what his wife was doing, and she had to be accountable to him. But Richard didn't have to be accountable to Diane.
Little does he know, she's enjoying being sexually dominated by a man she met online. When Richard finds out, he can't bear the idea of another man having power over his wife.
Well, initially discovering it, absolutely, it made Richard very angry. There are two reasons that made him so angry. The one side of it would be the infidelity. The other side of it would be lack of control.
Can you imagine you have a really controlling husband who thinks he knows his wife and assumes he knows how she's spending her day, to find out that she's been fooling him for a period of time by having sex with another man? And not only that, having kind of kinky sex? This was a big wound to somebody like Richard. It's like he was discovering a new wife, a wife he had never known before. He never imagined that his wife would actually leave him and choose another partner and have a sexual affair with someone other than him. This was something that was completely shocking to him.
In a towering rage, Richard confronts his wife.
You want to tell me what the hell that's about? Harry? Does Harry ring a bell with you at all? Harry. How about Master Harry?
Where did you get this?
He has a quick temper.
Why don't we worry a little bit more about what the hell is on this email as opposed to how I got it?
She was fearful of him, and she did what he told her to do.
Diane confessed. She told him there was an affair. She told him that it was over. And she didn't try to hide it.
Diane was extremely remorseful. She regretted having the affair with Harry. She would explain that she was so lonely, which drove her to seek out other attention.
Richard lays down the law once and for all. He, not Harry, is her real master. From now on, she'll live her life entirely on his terms.
They agreed to stay together and try to make their marriage work.
True to her word, Diane breaks the news to Harry that her husband has found out about their tryst.
As a result of Richard finding the emails, Diane ended the relationship with Harry.
She intended and made a lot of effort to save her marriage with Richard.
Harry isn't ready to let Diane go, but she insists.
Diane felt remorseful and thought she could save the marriage as long as she never committed adultery again.
But will Diane be able to keep her promise to Richard, and will Harry be prepared to release his sex slave without a fight? Richard is outraged by his wife's infidelity. But the domineering husband certainly isn't about to give up his own cheating ways.
Richard basically had this idea, what's good for me is not good for you. And although he could have an affair and do whatever he wanted, he still needed to be in control of his wife.
Richard never outright admits the affair to Diane, but his regular trips to the social club leave her with the impression something is going on. the club, Richard is consoled by his mistress, Doris.
Doris and Richard were mainly seen in the clubs, drinking.
He has carte blanche now. She had her affair. He can continue his now.
In Richard's twisted mind, he is the victim, and he lays out all of Diane's indiscretions for Doris, blow by blow.
It's hypocritical. He could do what he wanted, but she couldn't. There's dual standards.
As Richard spends more and more time with Doris, Diane is increasingly isolated and powerless to do anything about it.
Diane had to put up with whatever Richard did. Richard's going to show her that he can do whatever he wants.
He had her under control. As long as she stayed in her place, things would be okay.
And just in case there is any shred of doubt left in Diane's mind as to why her husband is treating her this way,
Well, Richard kept evidence of the affair because he had printed hard copies of the email messages that he had found and kept them stored in a desk in his house.
Richard would never let this go. He consistently would bring it up to Diane, particularly in those times where she did something which he was dissatisfied with, and that would be always something that he would throw back in Diane's face.
Richard's open aggression pushes Diane into a corner again. Now, will she be forced to take extreme action to save herself? Richard claims he's trying to forgive and forget, but for the next year, he keeps a close eye on Diane.
Richard apparently was trying to let the past be the past, but it kept coming back to him. He kept reviewing these email messages.
For almost a year, Richard finds nothing. But in July 2010, he sees a name he recognizes. It's a moment the domineering husband has pictured in his mind over and over again.
Whatever drove him to look into his wife's email account, not really certain.
Sitting in Diane's inbox is a message from Harry.
That showed him that, yeah, there was something going on.
For the past year, Diane has convinced Richard she's been faithful. The fragile truce between them is about to be shattered forever as an explosive jealousy seeks its ultimate revenge. Diane McAnulty has surrendered to a forbidden S&M affair with a man named Harry, whom she met online. When her husband, Richard, discovered the secret tryst, he forced her to end it. But now, a year later, he's discovered an email that makes him think things are far from over.
He had accepted Diane and Harry and dealt with it. It was apparently water under the bridge up until the time when he discovered the more recent email message.
Now, all the sordid details he previously read come flooding back, and Richard flies into a jealous rage.
The email was just a hello, thinking about you, how are you doing? And that was it.
Richard believes the message from Harry casts doubt over everything Diane has told him, and he demands an explanation.
What is wrong with you?
What is wrong with me? I thought you said this was over.
Richard and Diane got into an argument. They went outside by the door.
It is over.
It's not over.
It's
You see
over.
this? What is this?
Richard had the issue because, one, his wife had a relationship in the past that was sexual in nature, and his wife had contact again with that individual, and that's what brought it to the boiling point.
She didn't want to see Harry anymore, but Richard didn't believe that. And Richard had told her to pack her stuff and leave.
I haven't spoken to him.
Get the hell out of here! Get the hell out of here!
I can't take this anymore.
Diane gives in to her furious husband, for now. But after years of abuse, is this submissive housewife really prepared to take this latest outburst lying down? And how will her online lover and master, Harry, react to news she's being bullied by her husband? Later that day, July 11th, 2010, Greensburg resident Dawn Young is getting into her car with her family.
We were getting ready to leave. My husband saw a pickup truck coming through the intersection, and he commented that the truck didn't even stop at the stop sign. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes later, there was a large noise. And my husband immediately said that was a gunshot. And I laughed at him and said, it's the Sunday after the 4th of July, it's fireworks. And he said, no, it was a gunshot. And a few moments later, we heard 2 more. And we immediately started running towards where the sound was.
Dawn heads into the direction of the neighboring house a few doors down and is greeted by an image that is burned into her mind forever.
It was just a horrific sight. There was people, children, adults, everybody that had witnessed everything. And the next thing you know, the police and everybody rolled in, and it was just a very bad day.
Cops find a man with multiple gunshot wounds, lying bleeding on the grass. Other people from the neighborhood are desperately trying to save his life.
The neighbors had been trying to stop the blood from coming out of his wounds. One said the blood was shooting out of his back like a rainbow.
First responders arrive and quickly take over.
They worked on him in the yard. It seemed like forever, but it probably was maybe 10, 15 minutes. I think everybody, when this was happening, they were kind of numb, and I don't want to say in denial, but this is something that doesn't happen in Southwest Greensburg.
The emergency medical services transported the victim to the nearest hospital, where he was subsequently pronounced dead.
Eventually, the police reveal the name of the 37-year-old man killed in this explosion of violence.
The victim of the shooting was identified as Harry Mears.
Most of the neighbors had said that he didn't bother with anybody, but when he was out, he would, he was friendly, he would smile, he would nod. He was never mean or nasty to anybody. Nobody had anything mean or bad to say about him. He just was a quiet man who just respected everybody.
Investigators want to know why anyone would want Harry dead. They run a background check on him, and it turns up nothing.
It was just as much of a mystery to the people who responded to that shooting. They had no clue who had done this.
Witnesses at the scene are able to give police a good description of what happened.
The neighbors said that they were alarmed and alerted by the noises that they heard. This drew their attention.
The witnesses outside the residence on Oakland and saw Harry Mears rapidly exit the house through the front bedroom window. At about that time, there was a very loud gunshot heard, and Harry rolled into the yard.
Neighbors tell police that as Harry lay on the ground, they saw a man shoot him before getting into a pickup truck and speeding away.
My husband had heard them talking, and he said, oh my God, that was the vehicle that I saw come through the stop sign. So they immediately put an APB out.
Investigators now have a physical description of the killer, and it's relayed to all units within a 100-mile radius of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. There's an armed and dangerous suspect on the loose who has already taken one life. But then officers receive an unexpected break.
At the scene, Detective Coons and I were notified that the state police had received a phone call.
The caller claims to have information about the murder. And what he says will reveal the true horror of Harry Mears' final moments. Diane McAnulty is involved in a dark and twisted online affair with a man named Harry Mears. But a year after she ended the relationship, he's shot dead in a cold-blooded slaying. Now, a phone call is about to reveal how and why Harry was killed.
That day, we received a call through our dispatch center that an individual had turned himself in Indiana County to the Pennsylvania State Police and had admitted to the crime.
Police run a trace on the call and dispatch units to make an arrest.
Do you have your hands up in the air?
Yes, sir, I do.
All right, well, make sure your hands are up in the air. You can go ahead and drop the phone, but leave your hands in the air. Okay?
Yes, sir.
The man who called the police to confess to this shooting was Richard McAnulty.
Officers arrest Richard and bring him in for questioning. They have no clue why he'd want Harry dead, and Richard is offering no explanation.
Richard didn't want to talk to us. He would talk to us about anything unrelated to the crime, but he wouldn't give us any information about the crime in detail.
But police aren't going to be left in the dark for long. Shortly after the arrest, a second phone call comes in from a woman who claims to know Richard.
Kim Gray was the caretaker. She had been in the house for quite a period of time, and Kim and Richard had developed a pretty close relationship.
Kim gives police the link between Richard and Harry. Richard's wife, Diane.
She was aware that Diane had an affair with Harry and that Diane had expressed her remorse and how sorry it was that she had an affair.
Kim says that after a blowout fight, Diane leaves the house, and at that point, Richard turns to her for comfort.
Richard told her what was nagging him. He brought out the stack of email messages that he had swirled away in his desk,
Look at this.
threw them at her and said, "Read that." She told Richard that that's in the past. That was last summer. It's over. She encouraged him to let it be, to let it go.
Kim tries to calm Richard down, but it's no use.
Kim said that he left the house. He was angry and he was using phrases like, "There's a job that needs to be done."
Looking to substantiate Kim's claim, investigators bring Diane down to the police station.
Diane seemed very sad. She was upset. You could tell that she was very stressed because she knew that the homicide of Harry Mears was a result of the relationship that she had had previously with Harry, was a result of Harry reaching out to her again.
The next day, July 12, 2010, Richard McAnulty is charged with the first-degree murder of Harry Mears. And 1 year later, the case goes to trial. Prosecutors maintain that Richard learned where Harry lived from the emails he kept. And on the afternoon of July 11th, he makes the 45-minute drive to Greensburg, arriving at the front door of the man who had been cheating with his wife.
As Harry opened the door, Harry saw that it was somebody that he definitely did not want to see, which was Richard McAnulty.
Richard is determined to end his wife's affair once and for all.
Harry was running from Richard, and I believe he was yelling for help.
Harry makes it to his bedroom window, where his cries alert the attention of neighbors.
Harry was not prepared to die. He was trying to crawl out the window. And when he was shot the first time, he was crying for help.
Harry is in grave condition, but far from dead. However, Richard isn't finished with him yet. Bystanders watch in horror as he emerges from the house.
At that point, they observed Richard calmly walk over to Harry while Harry was saying, "Someone please help me." And Richard's response was, "You'll never sleep with another man's wife again," at which time he fired 2 more shots into Harry. The witnesses thought it was so strange that you kill someone in broad daylight and walk across the street like nothing's happened.
On July 18, 2011, Richard McAnulty is found guilty of Harry Mears' murder.
I believe that Richard killed Harry because he viewed Harry as a threat of taking control of Diane. And Richard was not going to let any man break that little controlling world of his up.
At the trial, it's acknowledged that even though Diane's affair was the catalyst for the murder, she's not to blame for her husband's actions.
I believe Diane was looking for someone that was more caring and more compassionate. And maybe she had these fantasies a long time and someone would fulfill.
Diane might have been having an affair, but nobody deserves to die for having an affair.
Harry should be remembered for everything but this. He should be remembered as a son, as a good neighbor, as a good person.
There is a profound and unsettling silence that exists in the most remote corners of the world, a heavy, suffocating quiet that seems to swallow all sound and hide all sins. When we think of the South Pacific, our minds often drift to postcard images of pristine beaches, swaying palm trees, and the endless, tranquil expanse of the Azure Ocean. We imagine a paradise untouched by the relentless anxieties of the modern world. But beneath this breathtaking veneer of tropical tranquility lies a complex, ancient world governed by deep-rooted traditions, unyielding codes of honor, and bloodlines that tie people to the earth as firmly as the roots of the ancient banyan trees. American Samoa, a breathtaking archipelago born of fire and volcanic ash, is a place where history is not just written in books, but is carved into the very landscape and embedded in the soul of its people. It is a territory where the past and the present breathe the exact same air, and where the most sacred bonds known to humanity are those forged by family and soil. In the early 2000s, this delicate harmony, the very fabric of existence on these islands, was violently torn apart in a remote village nestled deep within the rugged terrain of the Alata'a district. This is not just a story about a life taken too soon, nor is it merely a procedural recounting of a crime and its subsequent punishment. It is a dark, tragic exploration of what happens when the most sacred pillars of a society collapse under the crushing weight of greed, pride, and an unimaginable betrayal. It is a story about the devastating fracture of the Tautolo family, a tragedy that shattered a foundational cultural taboo and left an entire community grappling with a horror they never believed possible. To truly understand the magnitude of this tragedy, one must first understand the profound, almost spiritual connection that the Samoan people have with their land. In Western societies, real estate is often viewed merely as a commodity, a piece of property to be bought, sold, traded, or developed for financial gain. It is a transaction. But in the traditional culture of Samoa, land is something entirely different. It is the physical manifestation of ancestry, identity, and legacy. It is the blood of the forebears mixed with the volcanic dirt. The land holds the bones of the ancestors, and it is the sacred inheritance that must be protected and passed down to future generations. This vital relationship is carefully managed and fiercely guarded by the Matai system, an ancient, highly complex, and strictly enforced socio-political framework that has guided Samoan communities for centuries. A Matai is a chief, the head of the extended family unit, tasked with the immense responsibility of overseeing family affairs, mediating disputes, and, most importantly, managing the communal land. The Matai is expected to be the anchor of the family, dispensing wisdom and ensuring that the collective needs of the family outweigh the selfish desires of the individual. Under this system, the land does not belong to any one person. It belongs to the family as a whole, inextricably linking every member to the same plot of earth. It is a beautiful, deeply communal way of life that fosters incredible unity and a profound sense of belonging. But this very system, designed to protect and unite, can also become a pressure cooker of resentment and conflict when the delicate balance of power and inheritance is disturbed. When a dispute over this sacred communal land erupts, it is not merely a legal disagreement. It is a deeply personal, existential crisis that strikes at the very core of a family's honor, status, and survival. The Alata district, located on the western end of Tutuila Island, is characterized by its steep, unforgiving volcanic ridges, dense, impenetrable rainforests, and small, tight-knit villages where everyone knows everyone else. In the early 2000s, life in these remote areas moved at a deliberate, ancestral pace, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the demands of the harvest. Families relied heavily on their inland plantations, small, laboriously cleared patches of land carved out of the encroaching jungle, to grow crops like taro, bananas, and breadfruit. These plantations are often located far from the main village centers, requiring long, arduous treks up steep trails bordered by thick, untamed vegetation. It is in these isolated patches of cultivated earth that the people of Alata feel most connected to their ancestors, working the same soil with their hands, sweating under the same tropical sun. But this profound isolation also means that when you are on the plantation, you are cut off from the eyes and ears of the village. The dense canopy absorbs the sounds of the world, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the calls of tropical birds, and an overwhelming, sometimes oppressive silence. It is a place of life and sustenance, but its remoteness also makes it a place of deep vulnerability. Within this tight-knit district lived the Totolo family, a lineage bound together by the same ancient laws and deep familial ties that define the Samoan way of life. For generations, they had worked their communal lands, their history intertwined with the fertile soil of Alata. But beneath the surface of this familial unit, a dark and insidious poison was slowly taking root. A dispute over the traditional rights to a specific parcel of land had begun to fracture the foundation of the family. The exact nuances of this dispute were rooted in the complex, often unwritten laws of the Matai system, involving overlapping claims, historical grievances, and a fierce, unyielding pride. In a culture where status and identity are so closely tied to land stewardship, yielding even an inch can be seen as an unforgivable loss of face and a betrayal of the ancestors. The tension within the Totolo family escalated, mutating from quiet disagreements into bitter, deeply entrenched animosity. The traditional mechanisms for conflict resolution, the customary laws designed to bring harmony back to the family through mediation and mutual respect, completely broke down. The voices of reason were drowned out by the deafening roar of anger and entitlement. The dispute became an insurmountable wall, dividing blood relatives into bitter adversaries. When the structures of tradition fail to contain human rage, the descent into violence can be chillingly swift and unimaginably cruel. One member of the Totolo family, entirely consumed by the land dispute, allowed their grievance to fester into a dark, murderous obsession. This individual, whose identity would soon become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal, crossed a psychological threshold from which there could be no return. The land, which should have been a symbol of familial unity, became the motive for the ultimate destruction of that very family. The perpetrator did not act in a sudden, uncontrollable fit of blind rage. The tragedy of this case lies in the cold, calculated premeditation of the act. The killer knew the land, knew the deeply ingrained habits of their relatives, and knew exactly where the victim would be on that fateful day. They understood the isolation of the inland plantation, recognizing that the thick jungle would provide both the perfect cover for an ambush and a natural soundproof barrier against any cries for help. The weapon chosen for this grim task was not a modern firearm, but a common machete. In the context of Samoan agricultural life, a machete is a ubiquitous, essential tool. It is an instrument of life and sustenance, used daily by men and women alike to clear away stubborn brush, chop firewood, and harvest the heavy crops of taro and coconuts. Its heavy, broad blade is designed to slice through thick vegetation with minimal effort, driven by the strong, practiced swing of the farmer. Every household owns one, and its presence is as normal and unassuming as a cooking pot. But in the hands of someone harboring murderous intent, this everyday tool transforms into a weapon of devastating, terrifying power. The heavy blade, honed sharp to cut through thick vines, is capable of inflicting horrific, catastrophic trauma on the human body. The choice of the machete added a layer of profound, sickening irony to the impending crime. The very tool used to cultivate the sacred land was about to be used to desecrate it with the blood of a family member. The day of the incident began like any other in the Alata district. The tropical air was thick with humidity as the victim made their way up the steep, winding trails toward the family plantation. They walked with the familiar, steady cadence of someone who had made this journey 1,000 times before, entirely unaware that their life was about to end in a sudden, terrifying explosion of violence. The victim carried the quiet confidence of a person standing on their own ancestral land, a place that had always provided safety and sustenance. They were surrounded by the legacy of their family, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the deep jungle. But hiding within that serene landscape, cloaked by the dense vegetation and the heavy shadows of the canopy, was their own flesh and blood, waiting with bated breath and a tightly gripped machete. The ambush was executed with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. As the victim arrived at the secluded clearing of the plantation, isolated from the world and utterly defenseless, the perpetrator emerged from the dense foliage. There was no time for the victim to process the betrayal, no time to understand that the face of a relative was contorted in lethal hatred, no time to plead, and absolutely no time to defend themselves. The attack was swift, brutal, and overwhelmingly savage. The perpetrator lunged forward, bringing the heavy, sharp blade of the machete down upon their own kin with terrifying force. The quiet serenity of the plantation was violently shattered by the sickening sounds of the blade striking flesh and bone. The killer struck not just once, but repeatedly, delivering a flurry of fatal, catastrophic blows. Each swing of the machete was fueled by months, perhaps years, of boiling resentment over the disputed land, culminating in a ferocious release of primal violence. The physical trauma inflicted upon the victim was immediate and unsurvivable. The massive lacerations caused by the heavy blade severed vital arteries, leading to catastrophic and irreversible blood loss. The victim collapsed onto the very soil that had been the source of the fatal conflict, their life draining away into the earth at an agonizingly rapid pace. In their final, terrifying moments, bleeding out on the dirt of their ancestors, the victim was forced to confront the unimaginable reality that their own family had orchestrated their demise. They died alone in the overwhelming isolation of the jungle, far from medical help, far from comfort, the victim of a brutal slaughter committed by someone who shared their lineage. When the life finally left the victim's body, an eerie, heavy silence returned to the plantation, but the world of the Totolo family, and indeed the entire community of Alata, had been irreparably shattered. The blood that now soaked the ancestral soil represented much more than a loss of life. It represented the complete, devastating annihilation of the most fundamental principles of the Samoan way of life. In this deeply traditional society, violence against one's own flesh and blood is not merely illegal, it is the ultimate, unspeakable taboo. It is an act so unnatural, so completely devoid of human decency, that it fundamentally disrupts the spiritual and social harmony of the entire community. By raising a blade against a family member over a piece of land, the killer had not only ended a life, but had also desecrated the ancestors, mocked the Matai system, and severed the sacred bond that holds their society together. This was not a random act of violence perpetrated by a stranger in the dark. This was a calculated, intimate slaughter that tore at the very roots of their culture. As the news of the gruesome discovery on the remote plantation began to slowly filter down from the mountains and spread through the stunned, disbelieving villages, a wave of profound horror and deep, existential grief washed over the island. The investigation that would inevitably follow would not have to search far for a suspect, but it would have to navigate the incredibly delicate, agonizingly painful reality of a family fundamentally destroyed from within. The justice system would be forced to address an act of familial butchery that customary law could never hope to heal, setting the stage for a reckoning that would permanently alter the legacy of the Totolo name and leave a permanent, bleeding scar on the history of the Alata district. To comprehend the profound tragedy that befell the Totolo family, one must first deeply examine the life of the person who was so brutally taken and the immense, almost crushing cultural weight of the environment in which they lived. In the deeply traditional and historically rich society of American Samoa, a person's identity is never forged in isolation. It is intricately and permanently woven into a massive, living tapestry of extended relatives, ancient ancestors, and the very soil upon which they stand. The victim in this horrific case was not merely an individual going about a solitary, disconnected existence. They were a vital, functioning component of a much larger, ancient organism. They were a steadfast steward of the Totolo family legacy, a role that demanded immense physical labor, unwavering dedication, and a profound respect for the complex customs of the island. While the historical records of this case naturally focus heavily on the grim, violent details of their demise, it is absolutely crucial to remember them in the light of their life, a life wholly dedicated to the harsh, demanding, yet deeply rewarding work of maintaining the family's agricultural lifeblood in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of the Alata district. Their daily existence was dictated not by the artificial, modern construct of a clock, but by the relentless, eternal rhythms of nature and the heavy, sacred responsibilities placed upon them by their lineage. The victim's hands were undoubtedly calloused from years of gripping the heavy wooden handle of a machete, utilizing it not as an instrument of violence, but as an essential, life-giving tool of cultivation. They knew the precise, unmapped contours of the family plantation, the exact spots where the dark volcanic soil was richest for planting taro, and the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the ocean wind that signaled incoming tropical storms. This intimate, profound knowledge of the earth was not something learned from a textbook or a casual observation. It was a sacred inheritance, passed down through generations of Totolo ancestors who had cleared the very same stubborn brush and harvested the very same crops. For the victim, working the isolated plantation was vastly more than just a means of physical survival or economic sustenance. It was an act of profound spiritual devotion to their bloodline. Every drop of sweat shed under the unforgiving, beating heat of the South Pacific sun was a silent tribute to those who had come before and a vital down payment on the future survival of those who would inevitably come after. The plantation served as a sanctuary, a quiet, shaded place of refuge away from the bustling, sometimes claustrophobic and intense social dynamics of the village located far below. It was a secluded environment where they felt most fundamentally connected to their roots, standing firmly and proudly on the earth that bore their family name. The victim carried the quiet, unspoken dignity of someone who understood their precise place in the universe, firmly anchored by the unyielding certainty of their ancestral land. To fully grasp why this specific parcel of land was worth dedicating a life to, and terrifyingly, why it became something worth killing for, we must delve deeply into the intricacies of the Matai system, which serves as the fundamental bedrock of Samoan society. Fa Samoa, the traditional Samoan way of life, strictly places the collective well-being and honor of the extended family far above the desires or ambitions of the individual. At the very heart of this highly structured system is the Matai, the titled head and chief of the extended family, who holds the supreme authority over the administration and distribution of all communal lands. However, This authority is not a dictatorship. It is viewed as a highly sacred trust. The land in this culture is not owned in the Western capitalist sense of the word. It cannot be easily subdivided, fenced off with wire, and sold to the highest bidder for personal profit. It is a permanent, deeply spiritual, and indivisible inheritance that belongs to the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. Every single member of the extended family has a fundamental, birthright claim to live on and cultivate a portion of this land, provided they serve the collective family unit and show unwavering respect to the Matai. This brilliant system has successfully preserved Samoan culture and prevented the catastrophic mass alienation of native lands that has devastated so many other indigenous populations across the globe. But this beautiful, protective system of communal stewardship also contains the incredibly dangerous seeds of bitter, inescapable disputes. Because the family land is held in common, the specific boundaries between different branches of the family are frequently defined by oral history, subtle natural landmarks, and fading generational memory rather than by rigid, legally binding surveyor maps. When these fragile memories conflict, or when the immense pressure of a rapidly growing family demands more resources from a finite amount of space, the stage is perfectly set for intense, deeply personal, and highly emotional confrontations. The Totolo family, rooted deeply in the volcanic soil of the Alata district for generations, was absolutely not immune to these intense systemic pressures. They were a family of considerable standing, carrying a name that demanded respect within the complex, highly observant social hierarchy of the island. But with this respect came the immense, constant pressure to fiercely maintain and defend their traditional holdings. The fatal dispute that would ultimately claim the victim's life did not materialize overnight out of thin air. It was not a sudden, explosive argument born of a fleeting, temporary misunderstanding. It was a slow, incredibly toxic accumulation of grievances, a simmering, dark resentment that festered quietly in the shadows of family gatherings, whispered conversations, and formal village councils. The tragic disagreement centered precisely on the specific rights, historical usage, and invisible boundaries of a certain parcel of agricultural land, which was the very plantation where the victims spent their days toiling in the tropical heat. For the victim, actively maintaining their claim to this specific piece of earth was not perceived as an act of selfish greed or personal ambition. Rather, it was viewed as an absolute, uncompromising duty to protect the family's heritage from being diminished. To yield ground, to simply walk away from the disputed territory in the face of pressure, would be heavily interpreted as a devastating, shameful weakness, a massive failure to honor the countless ancestors who had bled and sweated into that very same soil long before them. Therefore, the victims stood their ground with steadfast determination, guided by a fierce belief in their rightful, blood-given inheritance and the deeply protective, ancient customs of their people. They continued to work the land, serving as a physical, undeniable manifestation of their claim, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that were beginning to completely consume the mind of their relative. As the weeks and months dragged on without resolution, the dispute over the plantation slowly mutated into a dark, impenetrable cloud of hostility that hung heavy over the entire Totolo family. The traditional, time-honored mechanisms for resolving such conflicts began to completely buckle and collapse under the immense weight of sheer, unyielding stubbornness and bruised egos. In Samoan culture, when a significant dispute arises within a family, it is typically and carefully addressed through extensive, highly formalized dialogue, strictly mediated by the Matai or a respected council of village elders. These crucial meetings are specifically designed to air grievances openly, find an acceptable compromise, and, most importantly, restore the vital, sacred harmony of the family unit. But in this particular, tragic instance, the dialogue failed catastrophically and entirely. The formal conversations dissolved into bitter, incredibly personal recriminations, heavily fueled by deeply entrenched pride and a total, absolute refusal to lose face in front of the wider community. The perpetrator, slowly becoming entirely consumed by their own warped sense of entitlement and a toxic, festering anger, began to fundamentally shift their view of the victim. They stopped seeing a blood relative, a cousin, or a sibling, and instead began to view the victim strictly as an insurmountable, infuriating enemy who was actively blocking their birthright. This devastating psychological transformation within the mind of the perpetrator is the darkest, most terrifying aspect of the tragedy. The shared bloodline, which should have been an absolute, ironclad guarantee of physical safety and mutual, enduring respect, became horribly twisted into a source of profound, sickening betrayal. The perpetrator's mind became a tightly closed, highly dangerous loop of obsessive resentment, where the only perceived, logical solution to the agonizing, endless land dispute was the permanent, violent removal of the human opposition. Despite this rapidly escalating tension and the palpable, barely concealed hostility radiating from their relative, the victim remarkably continued to make the long, arduous, and highly isolated trek to the mountain plantation. This incredibly dangerous decision was absolutely not rooted in ignorance, arrogance, or a reckless disregard for their own personal safety. Rather, it was deeply rooted in a profoundly ingrained, almost heartbreakingly naive faith in the fundamental, unwritten taboos of their ancient culture. In the conscious mind of the victim, the sheer idea that a family member would actually resort to calculated, lethal violence over a land dispute was simply and utterly inconceivable. The strict prohibition against harming one's own flesh and blood is undoubtedly one of the most sacred, inviolable, and deeply feared rules of FAA Samoa. The victim genuinely believed that while harsh words might be fiercely weaponized and familial relationships might be strained to the absolute breaking point over the soil, the physical boundary of human life would never, under any circumstances, be crossed by someone who shared their ancestors. They firmly believed that the sheer, horrifying spiritual and social weight of such a massive sin would permanently deter any fleeting thought of physical violence. This absolute, unwavering reliance on the cultural code of conduct provided a massive, completely false sense of security. It allowed the victim to confidently walk into the dense, isolating, and highly vulnerable embrace of the tropical jungle without a single ounce of fear, entirely and tragically unaware that the ancient, protective rules they trusted so implicitly were about to be violently, irrevocably shattered into pieces. The victim's continuous presence on the plantation, day after laborious day, was a powerful testament to their incredible resilience and their unyielding, profound connection to the earth. They were constantly surrounded by the quiet, overwhelming beauty of the Alata district, a landscape of breathtaking, rugged majesty that had safely sustained their extended family for countless generations. The towering, ancient trees, the thick, vibrant green undergrowth, the distant, highly muffled sound of the Pacific Ocean continuously crashing against the sharp volcanic cliffs, this was their entire world, a world they believed in their very core was inherently safe, protective, and thoroughly familiar. But this very same environment, this beautiful, isolated, and silent sanctuary, was also simultaneously the absolute perfect, horrifying theater for premeditated tragedy. The dense, overgrown foliage that generously provided shade and agricultural sustenance also provided absolute, impenetrable concealment for a predator. The extreme physical isolation that offered them peace and quiet also guaranteed that there would be absolutely no witnesses to the impending horror, no chance of sudden intervention, and absolutely no possibility of a desperate rescue. The victim, deeply entrenched in their steadfast dedication to the family land and their unwavering, beautiful belief in the absolute sanctity of their bloodline, had unwittingly and calmly walked directly into a meticulously designed, cold-blooded trap. They were a dedicated, hard-working guardian of the soil, wholly focused on the life-giving properties of the earth, and entirely, tragically oblivious to the cold, calculated death that was silently waiting for them just a few feet away in the heavy shadows of the jungle canopy. The morning of the incident broke over the Alata district with the familiar, heavy warmth that dictates the rhythm of life in the South Pacific. The sun crested the volcanic ridges, casting long, deep shadows across the dense canopy of the rainforest, baking the morning dew into a thick, clinging humidity. The victim embarked on the arduous trek to the inland plantation, walking a narrow, winding trail that had been painstakingly carved into the steep mountainside by generations of Totolo ancestors. This path was not merely a physical route. It was a deeply ingrained habitual journey, a daily physical pilgrimage into the absolute heart of the family legacy. The terrain here is notoriously unforgiving, a chaotic, relentless tangle of ancient roots, slick volcanic rocks, and encroaching, aggressive vegetation that demands extreme physical exertion and unwavering mental focus. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet, almost overpowering fragrance of wild, tropical blossoms. The familiar sounds of the village, the distant barking of dogs, the soft murmurs of morning conversations, and the rhythmic lapping of the ocean against the distant shore slowly faded away, swallowed entirely by the dense acoustic buffer of the immense jungle. As the victim climbed higher up the elevation, the isolation of the plantation became absolute and all-encompassing. They were entirely enveloped in a profound, heavy stillness, a secluded world separated from the watchful eyes of the community, governed only by the rustling wind and the distant, echoing calls of unseen birds. This was a place where one could feel entirely alone, yet inextricably surrounded by the powerful, invisible presence of the ancestors who had walked the exact same path. Arriving at the disputed parcel of land, the victims set down whatever meager supplies they had carried up the mountain and immediately surveyed the familiar agricultural surroundings. Their mind was undoubtedly focused entirely on the grueling manual labor that lay ahead, mentally mapping out which specific patches of taro needed tending, which heavy brush needed to be cleared away, and how best to maximize the precious daylight hours. There was a profound, quiet dignity in this labor, a tangible, physical manifestation of their unwavering commitment to their bloodline and their rightful place upon this disputed earth. The heavy, dark cloud of the ongoing family conflict might have lingered in the very back of their mind, an ever-present source of profound sadness and lingering frustration, but it absolutely did not breed terror. The fundamental laws of their deeply traditional society, the ancient, ironclad taboos protecting family from family, acted as an invisible, impenetrable shield around their entire consciousness. The victim believed, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that their physical person was sacred, thoroughly protected by the deep, unyielding bonds of shared ancestry. They moved about the clearing with the relaxed, unguarded posture of someone who felt completely secure in their own undisputed domain, their back completely turned to the dense, green wall of the jungle, entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that the invisible shield of tradition had already been fatally breached. The isolation that provided them with a sense of peaceful communion with the land was simultaneously setting the stage for a catastrophic vulnerability, completely masking the presence of a predator who had entirely discarded the sacred laws of their people. Deep within the dark, suffocating embrace of the surrounding undergrowth, completely hidden by the broad, waxy leaves and the thick, twisting vines, the perpetrator waited in absolute, terrifying silence. This was absolutely not a chance encounter or a sudden, explosive confrontation born of a fleeting, momentary argument. The killer had arrived much earlier in the morning, meticulously choosing a concealed vantage point that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the clearing while remaining entirely invisible from the main trail. They crouched low in the oppressive, damp heat of the jungle, their breathing shallow and carefully controlled, their eyes locked onto the clearing with a dark, consuming, and violently destructive obsession. In their hands, they gripped a heavy, broad-bladed machete. In any other normal context, this large knife would be recognized merely as the indispensable, everyday tool of a Samoan farmer, purposefully designed to effortlessly slice through thick banana stalks and tough, woody brush. But in the tight, sweating hands of the perpetrator, completely fueled by a toxic, festering resentment over the disputed communal land, the agricultural implement had been entirely repurposed into a weapon of devastating, terrifying lethality. The blade had likely been recently sharpened, its raw edge honed to inflict maximum physical destruction upon impact. The perpetrator gripping the handle was no longer acting as a recognizable member of the Totolo family or a custodian of the sacred land. They had crossed a massive, irreversible psychological threshold, transforming themselves completely into an executioner, willingly and calculatedly preparing to commit the ultimate, unspeakable sin against their own flesh and blood. The agonizing, drawn-out minutes stretched on, incredibly heavy with the suffocating weight of impending doom, as the killer patiently watched the victim move about the clearing, calmly waiting for the absolute perfect, most physically vulnerable moment to finally strike. The transition from profound, rural tranquility to catastrophic, explosive violence happened in a mere fraction of a second, creating an irreversible rupture in time and reality. There was absolutely no shouted warning, no angry, verbal confrontation to signal the impending, deadly attack, and no opportunity whatsoever for the victim to comprehend the sudden, terrifying shift in their previously safe environment. The perpetrator burst forth from the dense, concealing foliage with a shocking, ruthless velocity, entirely driven by months of deeply suppressed rage and a cold, hyper-focused intent to kill. The dense jungle canopy completely muffled the sudden, violent rush of movement, offering the victim absolutely no auditory warning of the grim death that was rapidly closing the distance between them. Before the victim could even fully turn their body around, before their brain could possibly register the shocking identity of their attacker or process the horrific, unfathomable betrayal unfolding before their widened eyes, the heavy steel blade of the machete was already descending with terrifying, lethal force. The very first strike landed with a sickening, devastating physical impact, the immense kinetic energy of the heavy swinging blade violently and effortlessly slicing through delicate tissue, muscle, and solid bone. The immense physical shock of the initial blow was immediate and completely debilitating, violently throwing the helpless victim to the rugged ground, entirely erasing any possible chance of a defensive struggle or a desperate escape. The perpetrator absolutely did not stop with a single, disabling blow. Entirely consumed by a frenzied, primal violence that completely erased their humanity, they stood towering over their fallen relative and delivered a rapid, merciless sequence of catastrophic, downward strikes. The machete, wielded with the practiced, intensely powerful swing of someone highly accustomed to clearing dense tropical brush, inflicted massive, utterly unsurvivable trauma with every single relentless descent. The sheer brutality of the sustained assault was overwhelmingly horrific, a terrifying display of physical overkill that clearly and undeniably demonstrated the deep, toxic hatred that had completely consumed the killer's mind. Each forceful swing of the bloodied blade was a brutal physical manifestation of the bitter, prolonged land dispute, a violent, desperate, and deeply personal attempt to permanently sever the victim's rightful claim to the ancestral soil. The massive, gaping lacerations caused by the broad, heavy blade immediately severed major vital arteries, leading to a catastrophic, rapidly unstoppable hemorrhage. The victim, lying helplessly and agonizingly on the dirt of their deeply cherished family plantation, was rapidly and violently drained of their precious life force. The profound physical shock of the traumatic injuries and the massive, rapid loss of blood completely paralyzed their nervous system, rendering them entirely incapable of crying out for help, even if there had been anyone remotely close enough to hear their final, desperate pleas. They were brutally trapped in a rapidly fading, terrifying sensory bubble of immense physical agony and overwhelming psychological disbelief, forced to spend their final, fleeting conscious moments staring up at the impassive canopy of the jungle and the contorted face of the family member who was actively slaughtering them. The deep, agonizing realization of that final betrayal must have been as excruciatingly painful as the catastrophic physical wounds themselves. The victim's blood, bright, warm, and vital, began to rapidly pool on the dark volcanic earth, thoroughly soaking deep into the very same sacred soil that had been the singular focus of their unwavering, lifelong dedication and the ultimate, tragic cause of their violent, untimely demise. As the victim finally succumbed to the massive, catastrophic blood loss and their battered body went entirely still upon the earth, a heavy, deeply suffocating silence violently crashed back down upon the isolated agricultural clearing. The frantic, horrifying sounds of the heavy machete strikes and the desperate, ragged, wet breathing of the final, entirely one-sided struggle were instantly and completely swallowed by the vast, uncaring, and immense expanse of the Alatawa rainforest. The killer stood completely alone in the immediate, chilling aftermath, breathing heavily in the thick, humid air, tightly holding a blade now thoroughly stained with the lifeblood of their own kin. The physical act of murder was entirely complete, but the immense, catastrophic spiritual, cultural, and social devastation had only just begun to take root. By striking down a blood relative on the ancestral plantation, the perpetrator had not simply ended a single human life, they had violently and irrevocably shattered the most sacred, deeply foundational pillar of their entire ancient civilization. The deep, historical taboo strictly against harming one's own family is the crucial, invisible, and powerful glue that holds the intricate, beautiful structure of Samoan society firmly together. It is the ultimate, unbreakable boundary that strictly separates civilized communal living from absolute, primitive chaos. By willingly and calculatedly crossing that profoundly sacred boundary, the killer had thoroughly desecrated the ancestral land, deeply and unforgivably insulted the spirits of the ancestors, and unleashed a massive, incredibly destructive shockwave that would eventually violently ripple down the steep mountain trails and completely devastate the entire Totolo family for generations to come. The victim lay motionless on the earth, eternally bound to the hotly disputed property in the most tragic, horrifying way imaginable, while the cold-blooded killer quietly turned around and seamlessly disappeared back into the dense, dark shadows of the jungle, leaving behind a fundamentally shattered family legacy and a deeply blood-stained plantation that would forever stand as a chilling, horrific monument to the absolute, terrifying, and completely destructive power of human greed, blinding pride, and the ultimate familial betrayal. The transition from the horrifying event to the agonizing realization of what had occurred was marked by the slow, inevitable passage of time as the tropical sun began its heavy descent over the rugged Alatawa district. Back in the village, the initial absence of the victim was not immediately a cause for widespread, frantic panic. It is entirely common for the arduous, physically demanding work on the isolated inland plantations to stretch late into the afternoon, dictated entirely by the sheer volume of agricultural tasks that constantly require meticulous attention. However, as the vivid orange and purple hues of the tropical twilight slowly surrendered to the deep, impenetrable blackness of the island night, a profound and deeply unsettling anxiety began to firmly take root within the extended Totolo household. The victim was a creature of steadfast, unwavering habit, profoundly dedicated to the highly predictable rhythms of their daily agricultural duties, and their total failure to return to the village before nightfall was an alarming, unprecedented deviation from the established norm. A search party was hastily and desperately organized, comprised of highly concerned close relatives and immediately adjacent neighbors equipped with heavy, battery-powered flashlights and a rapidly escalating, suffocating sense of impending dread. They anxiously retraced the victim's familiar, deeply worn steps, slowly navigating the treacherous, steep mountain trail illuminated only by the narrow, sweeping beams of artificial light desperately cutting through the oppressive, heavy darkness of the dense jungle. The massive canopy overhead completely blocked out any ambient moonlight, making the arduous, upward trek feel significantly more isolated, suffocating, and deeply foreboding. When the anxious search party finally breached the perimeter of the disputed agricultural clearing, the frantic, sweeping beams of their flashlights suddenly illuminated a scene of such profound, devastating horror that it permanently seared itself into the collective, traumatized memory of the entire village. The grim discovery was not merely the finding of a deceased, deeply loved relative. It was the traumatic, deeply shocking, and completely unexpected unveiling of a catastrophic act of immense, unimaginable savagery. The massive, undeniable physical trauma inflicted upon the victim's battered body made it immediately and horrifyingly clear that this was absolutely no tragic, unfortunate agricultural accident or sudden, unexpected medical emergency. The sheer, terrifying brutality of the deep machete wounds instantly communicated a chilling, undeniable narrative of highly intentional, deeply personal, and cold-blooded slaughter. The frantic, desperate, and deeply traumatic descent back down the dark mountain to immediately alert the territorial law enforcement was a complete blur of overwhelming grief and chaotic, paralyzing disbelief. When the uniformed authorities from the American Samoa Department of Public Safety finally arrived at the remote, deeply secluded village, they were immediately confronted with a deeply complex, highly sensitive, and profoundly challenging environment. The massive logistical nightmare of effectively investigating a major, brutal homicide in such a remote, exceptionally rugged location was immediately and overwhelmingly apparent to the seasoned detectives. The isolated crime scene was located miles away from any easily accessible paved road, strictly reachable only by a grueling, physically exhausting hike through dense, unforgiving volcanic terrain that severely complicated and heavily delayed the necessary transport of heavy forensic equipment and specialized medical personnel. The determined investigators had to meticulously and desperately secure the isolated agricultural clearing while constantly battling the extreme, suffocating tropical humidity and the ever-present, looming threat of sudden, heavy tropical downpours that could easily, rapidly, and permanently wash away crucial, microscopic physical evidence. As the dedicated forensic team methodically and carefully processed the bloody scene under the harsh, artificial glare of portable, noisy generator lights, they were deeply and profoundly struck by the ferocious, deeply personal nature of the fatal attack. The massive, incredibly deep physical lacerations and the massive, catastrophic volume of rapid blood loss indicated a weapon of significant, heavy weight and extreme, terrifying sharpness, pointing definitively and undeniably toward a heavy, broad-bladed agricultural machete. In a rural, heavily agricultural region where absolutely every single household rightfully possesses multiple machetes for daily, essential survival and routine plantation maintenance, this specific, crucial detail offered a terrifyingly broad, almost completely unmanageable spectrum of potential murder weapons. Furthermore, the utter, chilling lack of any visible defensive wounds or obvious signs of a prolonged, desperate physical struggle strongly and undeniably suggested that the victim had been taken completely and totally by surprise, brutally ambushed by someone they very likely knew well and trusted implicitly enough to completely turn their vulnerable back upon. There was absolutely no physical evidence of a robbery, as the hardworking victim possessed nothing of any significant material value on their person, and the extreme, profound isolation of the high mountain plantation completely and totally ruled out the highly improbable possibility of a random, unfortunate encounter with a violent, wandering stranger. The experienced detectives quickly, methodically, and chillingly deduced that the ruthless killer absolutely had to be someone intimately and deeply familiar with the victim's deeply ingrained daily routines, someone who knew exactly, precisely when, and where they would be completely, utterly vulnerable and totally isolated from the protective, watchful eyes of the tight-knit community. As the complex, highly sensitive investigation rapidly shifted from the physical, forensic processing of the remote crime scene to the arduous, delicate task of formally interviewing the local residents, the outside detectives violently and immediately collided with a massive, highly complex, and completely invisible wall of deep cultural complexity and profound, paralyzing communal trauma. In the deeply traditional, highly structured ancient society of American Samoa, the immediate, completely natural instinct when directly faced with a profound, highly damaging internal family crisis is to immediately close ranks and desperately attempt to handle the highly delicate matter internally through the established, deeply respected hierarchy of the Matai system. The overwhelming, highly visible presence of uniformed, mainland-trained police officers actively conducting formal, recorded interrogations and firmly demanding concrete, immediate answers represented a highly intrusive, deeply uncomfortable, and massive disruption of the ancient, heavily established, and deeply revered social order. The frustrated detectives were not purposely met with malicious, calculated obstruction or a deliberate, highly organized criminal conspiracy of silence, but rather with a profound, deeply paralyzing state of collective existential shock, and immense, highly overwhelming cultural shame. The horrific, deeply terrifying realization that the brutal perpetrator was almost certainly a well-known member of the local, tight-knit community and very likely an actual blood member of the deeply respected, highly prominent Totolo family itself, was an agonizingly, exceptionally difficult truth for the devastated villagers to openly articulate to complete, uniformed outsiders. The ancient, fundamental taboo strictly against harming one's own sacred flesh and blood is so deeply and permanently ingrained, so fundamentally, absolutely vital to their entire cultural identity and social survival, that even openly acknowledging the mere possibility of its violent violation felt like a profound, unforgivable betrayal of their ancient, watchful ancestors. The highly trained investigators had to meticulously navigate this incredibly delicate, highly volatile, and deeply emotional landscape with immense, careful tact and extreme, calculated cultural sensitivity, deeply understanding that forcing aggressive, highly confrontational, Western-style interrogations would only inevitably cause the traumatized community to retreat much further into an impenetrable, completely unbreakable silence. They painstakingly, patiently conducted highly respectful, carefully and softly spoken interviews, slowly and carefully peeling back the intricate, deeply layered, and highly complex social dynamics of the grieving village in a desperate, highly focused attempt to completely uncover the hidden, dark currents of deep animosity that had ultimately and tragically culminated in the brutal, completely unforgivable slaughter. The highly critical, massive breakthrough in the incredibly tense, slowly moving investigation did not miraculously come from a sudden, highly dramatic forensic discovery in the deep jungle, but rather from the slow, meticulous, and incredibly patient unraveling of the complex, highly tangled web of extended familial relationships and deeply entrenched, long-simmering local grievances. As the respectful detectives patiently and carefully gained the fragile, heavily guarded trust of the deeply devastated community, the dark, highly toxic, and long-simmering history of the bitter, completely unresolved land dispute finally began to slowly emerge from the heavy, protective shadows of deep familial secrecy. The investigators meticulously, carefully reconstructed the complete, highly detailed timeline of the rapidly escalating conflict entirely centered over the specific, highly coveted parcel of ancestral land where the horrific, bloody murder had ultimately taken place. They slowly learned about the deeply contentious, highly emotional family meetings, the bitter, incredibly personal, and highly damaging recriminations, and the catastrophic, total, and absolute failure of the ancient, traditional mediation processes to peacefully and successfully resolve the agonizingly stubborn, highly destructive disagreement. The entire focus of the intense, sprawling investigation rapidly and inevitably narrowed down directly to the specific, highly involved members of the Totolo family who were most deeply, personally, and emotionally invested in the bitter, highly toxic conflict over the sacred soil. The meticulous detectives began to carefully and relentlessly scrutinize the specific alibis of absolutely everyone heavily involved, actively looking for any slight, almost imperceptible inconsistency, any suddenly unaccounted for, highly suspicious window of time strictly during the critical, early morning hours when the brutal, lethal ambush had been so meticulously and perfectly executed. It was precisely during this highly focused, incredibly intense phase of the investigation that the prime suspect's carefully constructed, highly rehearsed facade of complete innocence began to fatally crack and eventually completely crumble under the immense, crushing pressure of relentless, highly skilled law enforcement scrutiny. The suspect, a very close, highly recognizable blood relative of the victim who had been deeply, totally consumed by the toxic, festering land dispute, initially provided a seemingly highly plausible, perfectly structured timeline of their specific daily activities on the exact morning of the brutal murder. However, as the highly trained, deeply suspicious investigators meticulously and repeatedly cross-referenced their detailed, recorded statement with the corroborating, highly vital accounts of other local villagers and extended family members, fatal, glaring gaps and massive, undeniable contradictions began to rapidly and completely emerge. The suspect absolutely could not definitively or convincingly account for their specific, exact whereabouts during the highly critical, exact window of time when the victim had confidently made the solitary, fatal trek up the steep, winding mountain trail. Furthermore, their outward, highly visible physical demeanor during the initial, preliminary police interviews was deeply, profoundly unsettling, marked heavily by a strange, completely unnatural emotional detachment and a highly defensive, overly rehearsed, rigid quality that strongly and glaringly contradicted the profound, highly visible, and deeply devastating grief openly and freely displayed by the absolute rest of the completely traumatized family. The highly decisive, completely massive turning point finally arrived when the seasoned investigators sharply focused their intense attention strictly on the physical, tangible, everyday tools of the prime suspect's highly routine daily agricultural life. While the massive, incredibly dense tropical jungle offered near infinite, highly effective possibilities for permanently concealing a bloody murder weapon, the highly arrogant perpetrator had made a critical, completely fatal, and incredibly sloppy miscalculation. A heavy, extremely sharp agricultural machete specifically belonging to the suspect was eventually, highly carefully recovered and immediately subjected to highly rigorous, microscopic, and advanced forensic examination. Despite the suspect's desperate, highly frantic, and incredibly thorough physical efforts to completely clean and deeply scrub the heavy steel blade immediately following the brutal, highly bloody attack, modern, advanced forensic science proved to be entirely, completely unforgiving. Microscopic, completely undeniable traces of human blood and biological, human tissue, entirely invisible to the naked, unaided human eye but glaringly, completely obvious under the intense, highly magnified scrutiny of a modern laboratory, were conclusively and definitively discovered deeply embedded in the microscopic, deep wooden crevices of the heavy handle and the scratched, worn steel blade. The completely undeniable, highly scientific presence of the victim's specific biological material deeply embedded on the suspect's highly personal, strictly owned agricultural tool provided the massive, completely irrefutable physical link that the highly complex investigation absolutely and desperately required to finally move forward. When the deeply seasoned, highly prepared detectives finally, firmly confronted the prime suspect with this devastating, entirely conclusive, and completely inescapable physical evidence, the profound, complete psychological collapse was highly immediate, absolutely total, and deeply, profoundly chilling to witness in the stark interrogation room. The immensely heavy, deeply suffocating psychological burden of the horrific, ancient cultural taboo they had so violently and permanently shattered, heavily combined with a sudden, absolutely terrifying realization that they could no longer successfully hide behind the intricate, highly protective veil of deep familial secrecy or the ancient, highly respected traditions of the land, completely and utterly crushed whatever tiny fragments remained of their rigid, highly defiant resolve. There was absolutely no grand, highly dramatic, theatrical confession, but rather a completely hollow, deeply devastating, and entirely broken resignation to the highly inescapable, absolute, and completely horrific reality of their brutal, highly calculated actions. The formal, highly public arrest of the deeply broken suspect, a once highly respected member of the highly prominent Totolo family, sent a massive, deeply traumatic, and incredibly destructive shockwave violently crashing through the entire, completely stunned Alata'a district. The agonizingly painful, completely undeniable official confirmation that the brutal, extremely cold-blooded killer was indeed a highly close, immediate blood relative entirely and completely validated the tight-knit community's absolute worst, most deeply and profoundly feared nightmare. The highly alert territorial police securely and carefully escorted the entirely defeated perpetrator down the steep, highly winding mountain paths, leading them permanently away from the highly ancient, deeply ancestral lands they had so desperately, violently, and ultimately pointlessly sought to totally control, and directly towards the highly cold, extremely unforgiving, and deeply sterile, rigid reality of the highly formalized modern criminal justice system. The immense, highly sprawling, and deeply complex investigation had completely successfully unmasked the brutal, deeply hidden killer and fully secured the highly crucial physical evidence absolutely necessary for a major, highly successful prosecution, but it absolutely and completely could not provide any profound, deeply comforting answers or any real solace to the deeply agonizing, highly existential, and profoundly cultural questions that now violently, permanently plagued the completely shattered community. The modern authorities had successfully and entirely solved the highly grim, strictly physical mechanics of the brutal, calculated homicide, but the immense, entirely catastrophic and highly devastating spiritual and deeply cultural damage violently inflicted upon the deeply traditional, highly ancient society remained a massive, heavily bleeding, and entirely unhealed, gaping wound. The formal judicial proceedings that followed the arrest of the perpetrator were not merely a series of courtroom sessions, but a slow, agonizing public dissection of the most profound cultural trauma the Alata district had ever endured. The trial took place in a somber, intensely formal atmosphere within the high courts of American Samoa, a stark contrast to the verdant, rugged mountain trails where the violence had occurred. The courtroom was packed with members of the Totolo family, the village elders, and concerned citizens from across the territory, all of whom carried the heavy, suffocating burden of the tragedy. Every individual present in that room understood that the legal outcome would do little to alleviate the deep, permanent spiritual fracture that had been driven through their community. The prosecution, representing the territorial government, approached the case with a gravity that acknowledged the unique, sensitive intersection of modern law and ancient, deep-rooted tradition. They presented their evidence with cold, surgical precision, meticulously reconstructing the days leading up to the murder to show that this was not a sudden act of passion, but a calculated, premeditated execution fueled by a singular, consuming obsession with the disputed communal land. The evidence gathered, the recovered machete with its microscopic, undeniable traces of the victim's DNA, the testimony regarding the escalating arguments over the plantation, and the clear timeline of the perpetrator's movements, formed an airtight case that left virtually no room for reasonable doubt. As the trial progressed, the defense counsel faced the nearly impossible task of navigating the cold requirements of Western legal statutes while attempting to offer some context for the perpetrator's descent into such profound darkness. However, within the confines of the courtroom, the cultural nuances of the Matai system and the complexities of tribal land disputes were treated strictly as motive, not as mitigating factors for the cold-blooded slaughter of a kin member. The prosecutor painted a chilling, unflinching portrait of an individual who had systematically abandoned their humanity to satisfy a selfish, violent desire for control over sacred ground. The testimonies of the witnesses, many of whom were closely related to both the victim and the perpetrator, were punctuated by long, heavy silences and visible, palpable emotional exhaustion. These people were being forced to relive the most harrowing, shameful chapter of their family history in a public space, stripped of the traditional, private mechanisms they would normally have used to mourn and reconcile. The pain of the victim's surviving family members was raw and pervasive. They sat together in the gallery, their faces etched with the profound, quiet agony of a double betrayal. Not only had they lost a loved one, but that loss had been inflicted by someone who shared their own blood, their own name, and their own heritage. The courtroom reached a state of intense, suffocating stillness when the perpetrator finally took the stand or when their statements were entered into the record. There was no grand, dramatic revelation, no sudden outburst of profound remorse that could possibly wash away the stain of their actions. The perpetrator's demeanor remained chillingly detached, a hollow reflection of the individual who had once been a functioning, respected member of the family before being entirely consumed by the poison of greed and pride. The judge, a seasoned arbiter of the law, maintained a stern, unflinching composure, fully cognizant of the fact that this verdict would reverberate through the entire fabric of Samoan society. The trial was not merely about finding guilt, it was about upholding the fundamental, universal prohibition against taking the life of a family member, a concept that transcends borders and legal systems, but which holds an even more terrifying weight within the context of the Matai tradition. The prosecution's closing arguments were a masterful, somber summation of the evidence, emphasizing that while the dispute over land might have been real, the choice to resolve that dispute with a machete was an unpardonable, permanent rupture of the social and moral order. When the jury returned with their verdict, the outcome was as certain as it was devastatingly final. The evidence of the DNA found on the agricultural tool, combined with the detailed testimonies regarding the premeditated nature of the ambush, had left them with no alternative. The perpetrator was found guilty on all counts, a verdict that was met not with cheers or relief, but with a heavy, somber acceptance that mirrored the gravity of the crime. The sentencing phase, however, was where the true, absolute weight of the judiciary's judgment was laid bare. Given the extreme, premeditated brutality of the murder, the total lack of genuine, visible remorse, and the deep, irreparable harm done to the community's social fabric, the court handed down the most severe sentence possible under the law of the territory: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This sentence was a clear, unequivocal statement from the state that such a profound violation of the most basic, sacred human taboo would be met with the most absolute, unyielding rejection. The perpetrator would spend the entirety of their remaining days in the confined, sterile isolation of a prison cell, far removed from the fertile, volcanic earth they had once coveted and stained with blood. They were to be severed from their family, their land, and their heritage, left to live out their life in a state of absolute, well-deserved exile from the very society they had so violently betrayed. The immediate reaction to the sentencing was one of profound, somber finality. The Totolo family members left the courtroom in a quiet, organized procession, their expressions masks of contained, lingering trauma. There was no joy in this justice, only the heavy realization that the process had ended, yet the pain remained, as deep and unyielding as the mountains of Alata. The legal system had performed its duty, effectively removing a dangerous, destructive individual from the community and ensuring that they could never again threaten the lives of their kin. However, the courtroom doors closing on the perpetrator did not resolve the underlying, systemic issues that had paved the way for such a tragedy. The land remained, the history remained, the scars on the survivors remained. The trial served as a formal, historical record of the crime, a necessary step in the administrative response to violence, but it was fundamentally insufficient to heal the spiritual, cultural, and communal wounds that had been inflicted. As the news of the life sentence spread back to the villages of Alata, the reaction was characterized by a mixture of somber reflection and a deep, unsettling caution. The verdict provided a degree of closure in the sense that the perpetrator had been held accountable by the modern state, but the community had to grapple with the reality that one of their own had been permanently cast out. The memory of the trial would become a permanent part of the lore of the district, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to the younger generations about the perils of allowing greed and unchecked pride to override the sacred, foundational laws of the Samoan way of life. The judicial process had successfully navigated the facts, the evidence, and the law, but the emotional and spiritual resonance of the verdict was something that would continue to ripple through the family and the wider society for years, perhaps decades. The judge's final words in the sentencing of the perpetrator echoed through the courtroom, emphasizing the court's commitment to protecting the sanctity of human life against any claim of cultural or traditional justification for violence. It was a firm, uncompromising assertion that in the eyes of the law, the blood of a relative is as sacred as the blood of a stranger, and the act of taking that life is an unforgivable offense that demands the absolute maximum penalty the justice system can impose. The trial concluded, and the legal chapter of the Totolo family tragedy was closed, but the shadow of the act itself remained, a permanent, chilling marker of how quickly the most secure, ancient bonds can be dissolved when the human heart gives way to its darkest, most destructive impulses. The silence that followed the final gavel was not one of peace, but one of profound, heavy, and enduring realization, the realization that despite all the structures, laws, and traditions designed to keep a people safe. The ultimate responsibility for maintaining the sacred boundary of life lies within the individual, and when that boundary is crossed, the cost is a total, irrevocable, and devastating collapse of everything that makes a family, a community, and a society whole. The justice system had fulfilled its function, isolating the source of the rot, but the task of rebuilding the shattered spirit of the Totolo lineage and the Alata community would be a much longer, more arduous, and infinitely more painful journey, one that the formal, rigid machinery of the courts could never adequately address or fully understand. The trial was the end of the procedure, but it was merely one more step in the long, slow, and uncertain process of communal recovery from an act that will forever remain a dark, defining moment in the history of the island. The aftermath of the Totolo family tragedy did not resolve with the heavy thud of the judge's gavel or the finality of the prison sentence handed down by the High Court. Instead, the verdict marked the beginning of a long, agonizing, and uncertain period of reflection for the entire Alata district. In a society where the past is a living, breathing entity that informs the present, this act of violence could not be easily filed away as a solved case. It was a scar that had been burned into the collective consciousness of the people. The brutal nature of the crime, a member of the Totolo kin rising against their own flesh and blood with a machete on ancestral land, shattered the foundational myth of safety that had long protected the Samoan way of life. The community was forced to grapple with the terrifying possibility that the ancient, sacred taboos they believed were ironclad had, in fact, proven fragile in the face of modern greed and human resentment. The repercussions of this reality were far-reaching, influencing everything from how families approached the mediation of communal land disputes to the way the younger generation understood their obligations to their elders, their bloodline, and their soil. The tragedy served as a somber, permanent reminder that the strength of a culture lies not just in its codified traditions, but in the individual moral agency of those who live within its structure. For the Totolo family, the path forward was filled with an almost insurmountable degree of shame and existential sorrow. Their name, which had once commanded respect and represented a long line of dedicated land stewards, had become indelibly linked to one of the most horrific crimes in the history of the island. The physical plantation, once a symbol of their heritage and their connection to the ancestors, was now tainted by the spilled blood of a brother, a cousin, or a child. Many in the family found themselves paralyzed by a profound, gnawing guilt, questioning whether they had ignored the early signs of the perpetrator's descent into obsession, or whether they had allowed the pressures of the land dispute to fester for too long without intervening. The social dynamics of the family underwent a forced and painful reorganization. The authority of the Matai was questioned, the internal bonds of trust were stretched to the breaking point, and the simple act of gathering for family milestones became a fraught, melancholy experience. The rupture caused by the murder was not just physical, it was an ontological crisis that forced them to reconsider what it meant to belong to the Totolo lineage and how to reconcile their history with a present that was defined by a moment of unimaginable betrayal. The survivors had to walk a delicate line between mourning the life of the victim and dealing with the internal disgrace brought on by the perpetrator, a process that necessitated a level of emotional fortitude that most were never prepared to summon. As years passed, the incident became a whispered, cautionary narrative that traveled along the mountain trails of Alata, used by elders to remind the youth that the land is only as sacred as the people who maintain it. The machete, once an instrument of life that sustained families through the harvest, retained a sinister, dual meaning in the minds of the villagers, a constant, sharp reminder of how quickly the mundane can turn into the murderous. The landscape itself, with its steep ridges and dense canopy, seemed to hold the memory of the violence in its silence. Visitors to the inland plantations often spoke of a lingering, heavy atmosphere that made them uneasy. This haunting quality was not a product of superstition, but a reflection of the deep, communal trauma that had been processed through the lens of their culture. The tragedy forced the territory to reconsider its approach to conflict resolution in remote areas, emphasizing the need for earlier intervention and more robust support for the traditional Matai system as it struggled to adapt to the mounting pressures of land scarcity and shifting socioeconomic values. The case highlighted the urgent necessity of bridging the gap between traditional communal governance and the requirements of modern legal and psychological support, ensuring that disputes could be addressed before they reach the point of no return. The reflection on this case also brought to the surface the uncomfortable truth about the erosion of traditional values in a rapidly changing world. While the Totolo tragedy was rooted in the ancient customs of land tenure, it was also inextricably linked to the modern pressures that have increasingly strained the fabric of traditional Samoan life. The allure of individual gain, the friction between communal obligation and personal ambition, and the breakdown of communication channels in an era of faster-paced, more fragmented lives were all contributing factors that the community could no longer afford to ignore. The horror of the crime acted as a catalyst for a more critical engagement with their own cultural identity. It forced a conversation about what parts of their heritage were worth preserving at any cost, and what parts needed to be revitalized or adapted to ensure that such a catastrophe could never repeat itself. This process of communal self-reflection was not about moving away from the FAA Samoa, the Samoan way, but rather about reinforcing the humanity that sits at its center, ensuring that no individual ever felt so isolated or so burdened by pride that they would resort to the ultimate betrayal of their own kin. The legacy of the Totolo tragedy thus became a permanent, albeit painful, part of the cultural curriculum, a lesson that the preservation of tradition requires a constant, active commitment to kindness, empathy, and the unwavering defense of human life. Looking back, the story of the Totolo case is not just a true crime narrative. It is a profound testament to the fragile beauty of family and the terrifying potential for ruin that exists when we lose our grounding. The perpetrator, now long forgotten by the world but serving their penance in the cold, windowless rooms of the state penitentiary, remains a ghost in their own family, a cautionary figure of what happens when a human being completely severs their connection to the collective moral responsibility of their people. The victim, in contrast, remains a symbol of the integrity that the community strives to hold onto, a hard-working, faithful steward of the earth who lost their life in a place they felt was safe, only to find that the most dangerous threats are often the ones closest to us. The pain caused by this act will never be fully extinguished, but the community's decision to move forward, to continue working the land, and to persist in their traditions despite the darkness, represents the most significant victory they could possibly achieve. The land itself, the silent, volcanic witness to the atrocity, continues to bear fruit, season after season, indifferent to the blood that once soaked its dirt but constantly providing sustenance to the descendants who continue to toil there. It is in this resilience, in this quiet, persistent act of returning to the fields and rebuilding the family unit, that the real healing of the Alata'a district is found. The tragedy remains a sobering, dark chapter in the history of the island, a reminder that the bonds of family, though theoretically sacred, are always subject to the failures of the human heart. It is a story that defies easy categorization and resists simple explanations, forcing anyone who studies it to confront the uncomfortable, messy, and deeply emotional reality of what happens when tradition, land, and lethal resentment collide. As we reflect on this, we are reminded of the essential, universal lesson that no matter how structured our world, how ancient our traditions, or how deep our roots, we are ultimately held together by our capacity for compassion and our ability to see the humanity in those who share our blood. The Totolo family and the district of Alata'a will always carry the memory of the tragedy, but they have also shown that life, however broken, has an inherent, persistent drive to mend. The case is a bridge between the past and the future, a solemn anchor that reminds the people of Samoa of where they have come from and the moral vigilance required to safeguard their future. The silence that now hangs over the remote plantations of Alata'a is different than it was before. It is no longer the silence of innocence, but the silence of a people who have walked through the fire, witnessed the absolute depths of human cruelty, and chosen, against all odds, to keep walking forward, together. The finality of the law was only the beginning of a much longer, deeper, and more significant recovery, a recovery that speaks to the endurance of the human spirit and the unbreakable, if scarred, strength of a family that, having been torn apart, continues to honor its legacy in the quiet, steady rhythm of the land they call home. In the end, the story of the Totolo tragedy is not a story of a single murder, but a complex, enduring story of the struggle to maintain one's humanity in a world that often tests our most cherished values, reminding us that every life, every piece of land, and every bond is a sacred trust that we are all, every day, called upon to protect. The narrative arc of the Totolo tragedy does not merely conclude with a judicial resolution or the somber communal reflection. It necessitates a deeper, more philosophical inquiry into the nature of cultural preservation and the resilience of the human spirit in the wake of absolute betrayal. When we look back at the Alataw district in the early years of the new millennium, we see a community that was momentarily frozen by a collective, existential terror. The killing was more than a localized act of violence. It was a profound rupture in the narrative of the Samoan people, a moment where the ancient, sacred taboos failed to restrain the darkest impulses of an individual. This final analysis seeks to synthesize the threads of the story, the geography of the mountains, the weight of the Matai system, the cold reality of the machete, and the enduring, painful silence that followed, to understand how such a wound eventually begins to scar over, though it may never fully disappear. The lessons extracted from this tragedy are not meant to pathologize a culture or to sensationalize the act of a single, broken individual, but rather to highlight the immense, constant effort required to maintain the delicate balance between tradition and the evolving, often conflicting pressures of the modern world. The land itself, that verdant, volcanic stage upon which this drama played out, continues to exist as a silent witness to the history of the Totolo name. In the years following the trial, the plantation became a place of complex emotional geography. For those who returned to the soil to cultivate the taro and the breadfruit, the physical environment served as a bridge between the trauma of the past and the necessity of the present. Every day spent working the land was an act of defiance against the shadow cast by the perpetrator, a quiet, repetitive assertion that life and legacy would continue despite the interruption of violence. This persistent, daily return to the fields underscores a fundamental aspect of Samoan resilience, the belief that the land is an anchor and that to abandon it in the face of tragedy would be a second, more damaging surrender. The survivors, in their silent, rhythmic labor, were effectively reclaiming their heritage from the stain of the murder, proving that while a person can be taken, the connection to the ancestral earth is a bond that persists, provided there are hands willing to work it. This is not to suggest that the process of recovery was either linear or complete, but rather that it was a persistent, adaptive response to an otherwise unimaginable horror. Furthermore, we must address the evolving role of the Matai system in the aftermath of such a cataclysm. The failure of traditional mediation in this case was the catalyst for a significant, albeit often quiet, transformation in how land disputes are managed across the territory. The tragedy stripped away the illusion that communal tradition alone is a sufficient safeguard against the encroachment of destructive, individualistic resentment. Instead, it highlighted the necessity of a multifaceted approach to conflict, one that integrates the deep, ancestral wisdom of the village chiefs with a greater, more proactive engagement with modern mechanisms for legal, psychological, and social support. By acknowledging that internal family conflicts can escalate into lethal events, the community began to foster a more open, albeit difficult, dialogue about the pressures that individual family members face. The Totolo tragedy forced a reckoning with the fact that silence, while traditionally a virtue in the interest of family honor, could also become a shroud that allowed destructive impulses to bloom in the dark. The subsequent years saw a shift toward more transparent communication, not by abandoning the Matai system, but by strengthening its capacity to handle the realities of modern stressors. As we consider the broader implications of this case, we are drawn to the figure of the perpetrator, who now resides in the sterile, restrictive environment of a prison, stripped of the land and the status that once defined their identity. Their existence is a stark, cautionary embodiment of what happens when a person loses their place in the collective. In the context of Samoan society, where identity is defined by the community, the perpetrator is, in every sense, a ghost. Their isolation serves as a profound, albeit bleak, commentary on the consequences of severing the most fundamental bonds of kin. They sought to secure their position by destroying the very people who legitimized their existence, and in doing so, they ensured their own total erasure from the narrative of their people. This paradox is the ultimate tragedy of the case. The desire to possess a piece of the ancestral soil led to the permanent loss of the community that gave that land its meaning. It is a lesson that echoes across cultures, reminding us that the pursuit of personal control, when divorced from the ethics of our connections to others, ultimately leads to a state of profound, absolute emptiness. The victim, conversely, lives on not through their physical presence, but through the memory of their steadfast dedication. Their death, while senseless and brutal, paradoxically reinforced the importance of the very values they died defending. The community's ongoing commitment to the communal land, to the respect of elders, and to the sanctity of the family unit is a living tribute to the life they lived. The silence in the Alata'a district today is no longer an oppressive, heavy void. It is a silence of continuity, a space where the trauma has been integrated into the history of the place. We see this in the way the stories of the past are shared, in the deliberate care with which the young are taught about the responsibilities of the Matai, and in the collective decision to prioritize the healing of the family over the settling of grievances. The Totolo case has become a moral reference point, a dark star that helps the community navigate the complexities of their evolving traditions. As we conclude this exploration, it is essential to reflect on the nature of the medium, the true crime genre, and its responsibility when handling such deeply intimate and culturally specific tragedies. To tell the story of the Totolo family is to navigate a narrow path between the urge to analyze the mechanics of the crime and the need to preserve the dignity of those who were irreparably harmed. This narrative was never intended to be a mere accumulation of horrific details, but an attempt to understand the rupture in the human fabric that occurred on that mountain slope. We are left with the profound realization that every act of violence, no matter how remote, is a tear in the tapestry of our shared existence. When we look at the Alata'a district, we are not looking at a place defined by a single, dark event. We are looking at a living, resilient society that has survived a profound test. The strength of the people of American Samoa is not found in the absence of pain, but in their capacity to hold that pain while continuing to walk the path of their ancestors. The legacy of this tragedy is ultimately one of vigilance and love. It asks us to consider the state of our own bonds, the families we belong to, the communities we serve, and the lands we occupy. It challenges us to confront the silence in our own lives, to recognize the importance of resolving conflict before it calcifies into resentment, and to cherish the fundamental, sacred reality of human connection. The story of the Totolo family is finished, yet it is never truly over, for as long as people continue to live, work, and love within the shadow of that mountain, they are writing new chapters. They are the ones who have taken the shattered pieces of their history and, with painstaking care, have begun the process of reassembling them into something that, while bearing the marks of the break, is stronger and more resilient than before. This is the true measure of their humanity, a testament that no amount of violence, no matter how calculated or intimate, can completely extinguish the drive of a people to remain whole. In the final analysis, the Alata'a tragedy remains a mirror held up to the human experience. It forces us to look past the machete and the blood to the underlying anxieties of the heart. It asks what it means to be a custodian of history and how we hold on to our values when the world demands change. The story of the Totolo family is a journey from the light of tradition, through the darkness of betrayal, and into the difficult, uncertain, but necessary light of recovery. It is a narrative that belongs to the people of Samoa, a story of an island that has seen the absolute worst of what a human being can do to another and has responded with a stubborn, life-affirming refusal to be defined by that darkness. As the sun continues to rise over the volcanic ridges of Alata'a, casting its long, familiar shadows across the plantations, it illuminates a community that, though forever altered, continues to exist as a testament to the fact that while tradition may be challenged and families may be broken, the human spirit, when rooted in the earth of its ancestors, possesses an enduring, quiet, and profound power to endure and to eventually, hopefully, find its way back to a kind of peace that surpasses. The memory of the blade. The final lingering question that permeates the history of the Totolo family tragedy is not simply what happened on that fatal morning in the Alata district, but rather how a society fundamentally built upon the architecture of unity continues to exist in the shadow of such profound internal fragmentation. As the years have accumulated since the incident, the narrative has shifted from the shock of the crime itself to the enduring legacy of the psychological and cultural aftermath. The profound, haunting reality remains that for those who lived through the investigation, the trial, and the subsequent sentencing, the case was never truly closed. A verdict of life imprisonment provides a legal resolution, a mechanism by which the state excises a harmful element to preserve the integrity of the collective, but it does not address the spiritual void left behind by the act of fratricidal betrayal. The community has had to develop an internal vocabulary for this, a way to speak about the unspeakable without destroying the fragile, reassembled pieces of their social identity. The story of the Totolo family has thus become a foundational, cautionary myth in the modern history of American Samoa, a narrative passed down not to celebrate the violence, but to serve as a constant, necessary reminder of the fragility of the peace that they have worked so hard to maintain. To understand the long-term impact on the community, one must consider the shift in how communal space is now navigated. The inland plantations, once synonymous with a quiet, meditative form of isolation, now carry a dual weight. For the new generation of the Totolo family and their neighbors in the Alata district, these areas are sites of both sustenance and somber recollection. The act of returning to the fields is no longer an unconscious, habitual endeavor. It is a conscious, active choice to reclaim the land from the darkness that once visited it. This reclamation is essential to the healing process. If the land were to be abandoned, if it were allowed to be reclaimed by the encroaching jungle, it would be a symbolic admission that the violence had won, that the dispute had succeeded in permanently fracturing the family's legacy. Instead, the persistent labor of the villagers, the tilling, the clearing, the harvesting, acts as a perpetual, physical affirmation that life is stronger than the impulses that once threatened to tear it asunder. This is the quiet, daily resilience of the people, an act of faith that defies the historical stain of the tragedy. The internal evolution of the Totolo family itself provides perhaps the most poignant look at how such a wound heals. The family had to navigate the transition from a unit characterized by a rigid, traditional power structure to one that had to integrate the stark, cold reality of a murderer in their midst. Many family members had to reconcile their love for the victim with the inevitable, agonizing acknowledgement of the perpetrator's biological and social role within the kin group. This reconciliation was not about forgiveness in the sense of excusing the act, but rather about creating a new, durable framework for survival that could encompass the memory of the crime without being consumed by it. They had to learn how to exist in a world where the person they lost was gone forever, and the person who took them was, in a sense, equally lost to the silence of the prison system. The family's endurance, their continued presence in the village councils, and their participation in the communal obligations of the Matai system speak to a profound, quiet courage. They have refused to let the tragedy be the final word on their lineage, choosing instead to write a future that, while marked by the scars of the past, is defined by the endurance of their shared humanity. The role of the broader society in the Alata district has also been transformed. The tragedy acted as a catalyst for a greater, more sophisticated integration of traditional conflict resolution with modern resources. There is now a more nuanced understanding that the preservation of culture does not require the suppression of dissent, but rather the creation of safe, structured, and effective ways to manage the inevitable friction that arises in any community. The district has become more vigilant, not in the sense of surveillance, but in the sense of communal care. There is an increased sensitivity to the early warning signs of despair, obsession, and isolation, reflecting a collective commitment to ensuring that no one is left to spiral into a destructive, solitary reality. This evolution is perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire case, as it demonstrates that the community has learned from its darkest moment and is actively working to prevent the conditions that lead to such a catastrophic failure of the moral order. The memory of the tragedy, while painful, has become a vital, protective component of their social infrastructure. As we look at the broader context of the South Pacific and the unique, beautiful, and complex traditions of Samoa, we see that the Totolo case serves as a powerful reminder of the universality of the human condition. While the specific cultural codes and the Matai system provide a distinct framework, the underlying themes of greed, pride, betrayal, and the struggle to maintain one's moral grounding are universal. The tragedy resonates across the globe because it touches on the fundamental fears we all share. The fear that the people we know best, the people with whom we share our blood and our history, are capable of the unthinkable. This fear is balanced by the awe we feel for the survivors who choose to build again. The Alata'a district, with its deep green mountains and the ever-present sound of the ocean, stands as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. It is a place that has been profoundly, deeply hurt, but has not allowed that hurt to define the limits of its potential. The people of American Samoa have demonstrated that the strength of a society is not found in the absence of conflict, but in the capacity to transcend it. Ultimately, the story of the Totolo family is one of persistence. It is a story about the way we hold onto each other when the structures that define us are shaken. It is a story about the quiet, invisible work of healing that happens in the hearts of the survivors long after the headlines have faded and the courts have moved on to other matters. As the light of the tropical sun filters through the canopy of the rainforest, it illuminates a landscape that is both ancient and constantly changing, a place where the memory of the past is honored without being allowed to obstruct the path toward the future. The Totolo family, the villagers of Alata'a, and the entire island community have emerged from this nightmare with a deeper, more mature understanding of their responsibilities to one another. They have proven that while the structures of culture and law are essential, it is the individual, daily, and persistent acts of empathy and kindness that keep a society whole. Their journey from the depth of the tragedy to this point of resilient, somber peace is a narrative of profound human significance, one that reminds us that even when we are tested to the absolute limit of our endurance, we retain the capacity to choose the light. The silence that now rests over the Alata'a district is not a silence of defeat, but a silence of presence, a presence that acknowledges the trauma, honors the lost, and continues, with a steady, unbreakable rhythm, the long and noble work of living. It is a story of a family that, despite having been broken by an act of absolute darkness, continues to find its way back to the truth that they are, and will remain, bound together, not just by the land they occupy, but by the love and the memory that refuse to be extinguished by the violence of a single, cold, and calculated day. This is the final, enduring truth of the Totolo legacy, a truth that echoes through the hills of Alata'a and reminds us all that the most powerful force in the human experience is not the sword, but the persistent, stubborn, and magnificent drive to sustain our connections, to protect our kin, and to continue, against all odds, to build a future that is worthy of the ancestors who paved the way before us. The tragedy, for all its horror, has not ended the story of the Totolo family. It has instead become a part of their ongoing, complex, and deeply human journey, one that reaffirms that as long as there is breath, as long as there is the earth beneath our feet, and as long as there are those who remember, the bonds of family will continue to exist as the most fundamental, challenging, and beautiful project of our lives. The conclusion of this deep, analytical, and somber investigation into the Totolo family tragedy necessitates a final, sweeping synthesis of the themes that have defined this narrative, from the volcanic landscapes of the Alata'a district to the innermost recesses of the human heart when confronted with the ultimate breakdown of familial trust. When we contemplate the history of this isolated community, we are forced to grapple with a paradox that lies at the center of the human experience. The very bonds that offer us our greatest protection and source of identity are also the conduits for our most profound and devastating wounds. The tragedy was not merely an event that occurred in a specific moment of time. It was a rupture that reverberated through the layers of time, connecting the ancient, sacred obligations of the Matai system to the clinical, sterile, and unforgiving realities of modern criminal law. As we draw this exploration to a close, it is vital to acknowledge that the story we have told is not one of finality, but one of ongoing, persistent existence in the wake of an event that threatened to dissolve the very definition of a family. The persistence of the Totolo name and the continued cultivation of their ancestral lands serves as the most powerful possible refutation of the violence that once sought to erase it. The land, which was the cause of the conflict, has transformed into the primary mechanism of healing, acting as a constant, physical reminder that the living continue to claim their place in the world precisely because they honor the history that preceded them. Reflecting on the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the perpetrator's descent, we are reminded that no individual exists in a vacuum. The poison of greed and the toxic bloom of resentment are not merely personal failings. They are social phenomena that thrive when the communal channels of communication and empathy are allowed to atrophy. The Totolo case remains a profound, cautionary lens through which we can view the importance of communal vigilance, not the kind of vigilance that watches for enemies, but the kind that guards the fragile, internal well-being of every member of the collective. When the victim walked up that mountain trail, they did so with the quiet confidence of a person who believed that the moral architecture of their world was enough to hold them safe. The fact that this confidence was shattered is not an indictment of their belief in the sacredness of blood, but a heartbreaking testimony to the reality that human moral agency is the only true barrier against chaos. The responsibility for preventing such a catastrophe, therefore, is not a burden placed solely upon the shoulders of the chiefs or the law enforcement officers, but a collective responsibility that is shared by every member of the community. Every act of kindness, every open dialogue, and every effort to resolve a simmering grievance before it turns into a flame is an act of defiance against the potential for such violence to occur again. As we look to the future of the Alataw district, it is clear that the legacy of this case will continue to evolve, shifting from a visceral, immediate memory of trauma to a more integrated, historical understanding. The youth of the Totolo family, those who were not yet born when the machete was raised in the jungle, will inherit a story that is etched into their identity. How they choose to relate to that story will define the next chapter of their family history. They possess the unique, difficult, and potentially liberating opportunity to transform the narrative from one of shame to one of resilient, intentional, and compassionate stewardship. They are the inheritors of both the land and the memory, and their presence on that soil is a daily, living choice to reject the dark path of the past in favor of a future that is rooted in the same principles that once protected their forebears. The resilience of this community is not found in their ability to forget, but in their capacity to hold the memory of the darkness, while steadfastly choosing to build their lives in the light of their shared, communal, and deeply interconnected humanity. This transition from the paralysis of trauma to the agency of recovery is the defining, quiet achievement of the Totolo descendants. The broader lesson of this investigation, when taken as a whole, is a reaffirmation of the power of the true crime genre to serve as more than just a recitation of facts. When handled with the gravity and the respect that such a tragedy deserves, it acts as a mirror that forces us to examine the foundational, often taken for granted, structures of our own lives. We are all, in various ways, bound to our own ancestors, our own families, and our own communities, and we all navigate the complex tension between the desire for personal gain and the duty to the collective. The Totolo case, in its specific, localized intensity, speaks to these universal human tensions, reminding us that no structure, however ancient or protective, is exempt from the trials of the human condition. The machete, once a humble, useful, and life-sustaining tool, remains a potent, unsettling symbol of how easily the familiar can become the fatal, and how important it is that we remain cognizant of the impulses we carry within ourselves. We are all, at every moment, architects of our own history, building our lives upon the soil that others have cleared for us, and it is our collective duty to ensure that the work we do on that land is worthy of the peace that we have inherited. As we close the final chapter of this narrative, we acknowledge the quiet, enduring presence of the island of Tutuila, the rugged, beautiful and deeply storied home of the Totolo people. The Pacific Ocean, with its vast, unceasing pulse, continues to shape the contours of the land, just as the history of the people continues to shape the character of the culture. The Totolo story is but one thread in the vast, intricate, and ever-expanding tapestry of Samoan life, a thread that has been dyed in the colors of both joy and deep, abiding sorrow. That the thread remains, and that it continues to be woven into the daily reality of the village, is a testament to the fact that the bonds of family are not easily severed, even by the most brutal of acts. The memory of the victim, the life that was taken, continues to exist in the collective memory, a presence that reminds the community of the precious, ephemeral nature of the lives they lead. And the presence of the perpetrator, though far removed, remains a spectral reminder of the absolute cost of failing to honor those bonds. In the final reckoning, we are left with a sense of profound, humble respect for the people of Alata. They have been through the fire, they have endured the unimaginable, and they have emerged with a maturity and a depth of spirit that only such an experience can forge. Their story is a reminder that the world is a place of immense beauty and equally immense potential for tragedy, and that we are all, every day, called upon to be the guardians of our own humanity. The silence that now hangs over the mountains of Tutuila is a silence of wisdom, a silence of a people who have learned that the most difficult, most vital, and most beautiful work is the work of staying together, of forgiving the unforgivable, and of continuing, in the face of all the darkness that the world can summon, to reach for one another. The Totolo family and their persistence have shown us that the story of a life, the story of a family, and the story of a people is always a work in progress, a project that is never truly finished as long as there is the courage to stand upon the land, to work the soil, and to look with open eyes and an open heart toward the horizon. Ultimately, the act of telling this story has been an attempt to honor the reality of the Totolo family's experience, to capture the nuance of their struggle, and to provide a space for the reflection that such a profound tragedy necessitates. We hope that in doing so, we have offered more than just a narrative of violence, but a testament to the endurance of those who survived it. The story of the Alata district, in all its complexity, remains a living piece of history, one that will continue to offer its lessons to those who are willing to listen with the care, the patience, and the empathy that the subject matter demands. As we step back from this inquiry, we are reminded of the fundamental, irrefutable truth that we are all connected, that our actions have ripple effects that stretch far beyond our own lives, and that the protection of the human spirit, the spirit of our families, our kin, and our communities, is the most sacred, most challenging, and most noble project that we can ever undertake. The Totolo tragedy, once a moment of complete and total rupture, has become a part of the long, resilient, and enduring arc of their people, an arc that bends, yes, but does not break. It is a story of life, of death, and of the quiet, determined, and deeply human effort to find, in the aftermath of the absolute collapse, a way to rebuild, a way to remember, and a way to continue to live on the land that they are proud to call their own. The final chapter of this profound and harrowing journey into the heart of the Totolo tragedy brings us to a place of somber synthesis, where the raw, agonizing particulars of the crime merge with the broader, enduring realities of the human condition. When we look back at the trajectory of this narrative, from the initial, peaceful rhythms of life in the remote Alata district to the catastrophic, blood-stained climax on the ancestral plantation, and finally to the long, arduous process of communal reckoning, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that tragedy does not exist in isolation. It is an inseparable part of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the history, culture, and daily life of the Samoan people. The machete, once a symbol of the vital, life-giving labor that sustained the Totolo kin, has been permanently transformed in the collective consciousness into an emblem of the catastrophic failure of familial love. Yet, as we reflect on the years that have passed since that dark, fateful morning, the ultimate story is not one of total destruction, but one of persistent, stubborn, and deeply moving endurance. The Totolo family, despite having been shattered by an act of absolute darkness, continues to exist as a testament to the fact that the bonds of blood, while fragile, possess a resilience that can survive even the most unforgiving of tests. In the final accounting, the Totolo case offers us a chillingly clear reflection of what happens when the human heart loses its anchor in the collective. The perpetrator, in their relentless, obsessive quest to possess a portion of the communal land, failed to understand that the land itself had no meaning outside of the relationships that defined it. By choosing to kill a family member, they were not merely eliminating an obstacle, they were severing the very limbs of the tree that provided them with their own existence and identity. This is the ultimate, tragic irony of their actions, and it serves as the most potent lesson for any who would prioritize individual desire over the sacred trust of family. The prison cell that now holds the perpetrator is not just a place of physical confinement. It is a space of total, existential isolation, a symbolic representation of what it means to exist outside the embrace of the kinship that gives our lives structure, meaning, and security. Their life is now a silent, stagnant monument to the futility of violence and the hollowness of a triumph won through the betrayal of one's own blood. The victim, conversely, lives on in the quiet, steady rhythm of the Alataw district. Their memory is not held in the records of the court or the grim details of the crime scene, but in the resilient, daily life of the community that continues to honor the principles of stewardship and communal care. Every time a young member of the Totolo lineage learns the history of their ancestral land, every time the family gathers to manage the complexities of their shared heritage, and every time someone walks the mountain trails with an open heart and a commitment to peace, the victim is remembered. This is the true, enduring victory, a victory that is not loud or triumphant, but quiet, consistent, and profoundly significant. It is a victory that asserts the importance of life in the face of death and the power of love to heal the wounds that hate has inflicted. The victim's legacy is the living, breathing reality of a family that has chosen not to let the darkness define their future, but to integrate it into their history and move forward with a renewed, sharpened sense of responsibility to one another. As we step back from this inquiry, we must acknowledge the broader context of the American Samoan experience, a territory that stands as a unique, vibrant, and resilient beacon of traditional values in an increasingly modernizing world. The Totolo tragedy was not a failure of their culture, but a failure of a human being to live up to the profound, noble expectations of that culture. It is a mistake to view this case through a reductive or critical lens that ignores the beauty and the efficacy of the Samoan way of life. Instead, we should see it as a reminder that every culture, every system of governance, and every structure of communal life is vulnerable to the inherent complexities and potential for error in the human heart. The people of Tutuila have demonstrated a capacity for deep, reflective growth, using the pain of their history to fortify the protective structures of their society. They have shown that the strength of a people is not measured by their ability to avoid tragedy, but by their ability to survive it and to emerge with their traditions, their dignity, and their humanity intact. The silence that now rests over the remote plantations of Alataw serves as a final, contemplative meditation on the fragility of our connections. It is a silence that invites us all to pause and consider the state of our own families and our own communities. It asks us to look at the people around us, the ones we share our blood with, the ones we work with, and the ones we live alongside, and to recognize the precious, ephemeral nature of the bonds that tie us together. It challenges us to resolve the conflicts that simmer in the shadows, to communicate with honesty and empathy, and to hold our anger in check, so that it does not become a destructive force that ruins the lives of those we love. We are all stewards of our own relationships, and we are all responsible for the health of the connections that provide us with our identity and our purpose. The Totolo tragedy is a heavy, sobering call to vigilance, a reminder that the most sacred, most foundational, and most beautiful parts of our lives are also the most delicate, requiring our constant, active, and loving care. As this exhaustive exploration draws to a close, we are left with a final, lingering impression of the resilience of the human spirit. The story of the Totolo family is not merely a tragedy, it is a journey through the absolute worst that a human being can do, into the quiet, steady, and noble work of rebuilding after the collapse. It is a narrative of profound human significance, a story that resonates because it speaks to the fundamental truth of our existence, that we are meant to be together, that we are meant to support one another, and that we are meant to be the keepers of our own shared history. The Al-Attah district, with its breathtaking beauty and its rugged, volcanic heart, will continue to witness the life and the history of its people for generations to come. The Totolo name, and the memory of the tragedy that once threatened to define it, will remain a part of that story, but it will no longer be a source of despair. It will be a source of wisdom, a reminder of the price of the past and the necessity of the future, and a testament to the fact that, regardless of how dark the night may be, the light of human compassion and the strength of the familial bond, when nurtured with sincerity and love, will always find a way to endure. In the final analysis, we are all part of a larger, global human family, and the lessons learned in the remote villages of American Samoa are lessons that apply to each of us. The struggle to reconcile our individual ambitions with our collective obligations, the challenge of maintaining our values in a changing world, and the imperative to defend the sanctity of life against the encroachment of hatred are the defining projects of our time. By telling the story of the Totolo tragedy with the gravity it requires, we have sought to contribute to a deeper understanding of these universal truths. We have looked into the dark and, rather than being blinded by it, we have used the experience to better appreciate the light that we, as individuals and as communities, work so hard to maintain. The Totolo family's journey is a beacon that illuminates the path for others, showing that while we cannot always control the tragedies that visit us, we retain absolute control over how we respond to them, how we grow from them, and how we continue, with grace and determination, to build a future that honors the memory of those we have lost. The silence of the mountains is now a silence of peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of a deep, hard-won, and enduring acceptance that the story of our lives is always a work in progress, and that as long as we hold on to each other, we are never truly lost, and we are always, ultimately, home. The final, resonant word on this tragedy is not the violence of the past, but the persistent, beautiful, and unbroken promise of the future, a future where the memory of the fallen is cherished, the lessons of the history are honored, and the strength of the familial bond continues to serve as the most enduring foundation upon which we build the world we leave to those who come after us. The echoes of the Totolo tragedy, while having subsided into a somber, historical cadence within the Al-Attah district, serve as a final, resonant reminder of the fragility of the human pact. As we conclude this exhaustive exploration, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of a broader, more universal understanding of why such stories must be told, analyzed, and integrated into our collective consciousness. It is not sufficient to simply relegate such horrors to the annals of true crime or to treat them as isolated, exotic anomalies occurring in the remote reaches of the Pacific. To do so would be to miss the essential, harrowing lesson they offer about the nature of our own hearts and the societies we construct to contain them. The tragedy of the Totolo kin is, in essence, a profound, unflinching mirror reflecting the potential for darkness that exists wherever human desire, whether for land, status, or power, is allowed to operate without the tempering, grounding influence of communal morality. We have seen how the ancient, sacred structures of the Matai, intended to bind a family together in harmonious, ancestral unity, were fundamentally subverted by the very individualistic impulses they were designed to suppress. This realization is not an indictment of tradition, but a testament to the fact that no system, however venerable, can act as a substitute for the constant, daily, and conscious exercise of human conscience. When we consider the long, slow, and often painful arc of recovery that the survivors have undertaken, we are struck by the quiet, unyielding power of the human capacity to persist. The reconstruction of a family in the wake of such a cataclysm is perhaps the most difficult task a human being can face. It requires the slow, methodical stripping away of the resentment that the murder cultivated, the painful process of mourning a loss that is compounded by the knowledge of the perpetrator's identity and the daunting challenge of maintaining their place in a community that has been traumatized by their own bloodline. The Totolo survivors have done more than simply exist. They have continued to occupy the space of their ancestors. They have continued to participate in the village rituals, and they have continued to honor the memory of the fallen in the most pragmatic, essential way possible, by living lives that affirm the values their loved one died for. This is the ultimate defiance of the violence that was visited upon them. It is an assertion that the life lost was part of a larger, stronger continuity that cannot be severed by the blade of a relative, no matter how sharp or how deeply it cuts. This resilience is the true, beating heart of the Samoan people, a force that transcends the legalistic, administrative, and purely logistical outcomes of the trial and enters into the realm of the spiritual and the profound. Furthermore, we must reflect on the role of the landscape as a participant in this long, lingering narrative. The volcanic ridges of Tutuila are not merely a backdrop for the drama, they are an active, silent presence that dictates the terms of existence for those who dwell there. The land, in its rugged, unforgiving, and breathtakingly beautiful reality, demands a specific kind of relationship, one of humility, labor, and profound, enduring connection. By attempting to seize control of this land through violence, the perpetrator committed a category error of the highest order, failing to grasp that one cannot possess what one does not truly serve. The land remains, indifferent to the grievances of the living, yet it continues to provide for those who treat it with the respect it commands. The current state of the Alata'a district, where the plantations are once again thriving and the daily routines of life have resumed their ancestral pace, serves as a quiet, definitive rejection of the perpetrator's destructive philosophy. It is a place that has been reconciled with its own shadow, a place that has learned that to survive, one must be as persistent as the jungle itself, constantly growing over the scars and reasserting the primacy of life. The legal and judicial dimensions of this case, while essential for the administration of justice and the maintenance of order, were always and inevitably incomplete. The courtroom, with its formal procedures and its focus on individual culpability, provided a necessary, cold, and calculated closure, but it could not reach the depths of the existential questions raised by the act. The sentencing of the perpetrator to life, without the possibility of parole, was the absolute, logical endpoint of the state's involvement, a way of ensuring that the threat was contained. Yet, the true judgment of this crime was and is carried out in the silent, daily interactions of the villagers, in the way they look at one another during village meetings, and in the unspoken, communal understanding of what was lost. The Totolo tragedy changed the rhythm of their lives, and that change is a permanent, indelible part of the community's identity. The law may have dealt with the body of the offender, but the community is dealing with the soul of the act, a process that is far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more significant for the long-term health of the society. As we look outward from the specific case of the Totolo family, we are prompted to examine the universal challenges of the modern era. We live in a world that is increasingly characterized by the erosion of communal bonds and the elevation of individual autonomy, a trend that puts tremendous pressure on the traditional, tight-knit structures that have sustained indigenous societies for millennia. The Totolo case is a localized, extreme manifestation of this global tension, a reminder that the transition into the modern era is never without its costs and its dangers. It asks us, as members of various communities and families across the globe, how we can balance our need for individual success with our fundamental duty to hold one another in safety. It is a question that does not have a single, easy answer, but one that must be asked if we are to prevent the continued fracturing of our shared, collective reality. The lesson from Alata'a is that vigilance begins at home, in the small, seemingly insignificant interactions between siblings, cousins, and parents, and that the health of the entire social structure depends upon the strength of these smallest, most intimate threads. The narrative of this tragedy has now reached its final point of rest, a place where the facts are established, the history is documented, and the communal response is understood. Yet, the story continues to resonate because it touches upon the fundamental, existential truth that we are all, to some degree, custodians of one another's safety. The Totolo family, in their persistence and their painful, courageous recovery, has provided us with a map for navigating the darkest terrains of the human experience. They have shown us that even when the most sacred, most foundational bonds are broken by the unthinkable, the drive to build, to love, and to remember remains the most powerful force at our disposal. Their legacy is not the murder, but the resilience that followed it, a legacy that serves as a quiet, steady, and incredibly profound beacon for anyone who has ever felt the devastating, isolating weight of loss. As we leave behind the rugged, green mountains of Tutuila and the quiet plantations of the Alataw district, we do so with a deeper, more humbled appreciation for the strength required to maintain a family, to protect a community, and to continue, against all the evidence of the world's potential for darkness, to believe in the enduring, quiet, and persistent power of the light. Ultimately, the Totolo tragedy is a story that refuses to be forgotten, not because it is sensational, but because it is deeply, profoundly human. It reminds us that every life is an intricate, irreplaceable tapestry of connections, and that the act of taking a life is a destruction that ripples outward, affecting generations, shaping landscapes, and challenging the very foundations of the society in which it occurs. We leave this story with the knowledge that while the blade may have the power to cut, and the rage may have the power to destroy, the human spirit, when supported by the memory of the ancestors and the love of the kin, possesses an infinite, quiet, and miraculous capacity to rebuild. The Alataw district remains, the Totolo family endures, and the lessons of their struggle remain a part of our collective, human library, a silent, powerful, and lasting testament to the fact that, regardless of the pain we endure or the betrayals we suffer, our fundamental, beautiful, and noble responsibility is to hold onto the light, to honor the ground we walk upon, and to keep the promise we made to those who have paved the way before us. The story of the Totolo kin is complete, but the truth of their experience will echo for as long as we continue to care about what it means to live in a world where we are truly and essentially our brothers and our sisters' keepers.